The emergence of the Navigator gene represents one of humanity's most crucial evolutionary adaptations, born from the desperate necessities of interstellar expansion during the tumultuous period following the collapse of the Dark Age of technology. As mankind spread across the galaxy in the millennia before the Great Crusade, the fundamental challenge of warp travel became increasingly apparent. Standard human pilots attempting to navigate the chaotic currents of the Immaterium faced madness, death, or worse fates, as their minds proved incapable of processing the alien geometries and temporal distortions inherent to warp space. The first manifestations of what would later be recognized as the Navigator mutation appeared sporadically across human colonies during the latter stages of the Dark Age of technology. These early psychers possessed an innate ability to perceive the ebb and flow of warp currents, allowing them to guide vessels through the Immaterium with unprecedented accuracy. Unlike other forms of psychic manifestation that often resulted in demonic possession or catastrophic warp breaches, the Navigator gene appeared to provide a measure of protection against the predations of chaos entities. This resistance stemmed from the unique nature of their psychic gift, which functioned as a specialized form of warp sight rather than the broader spectrum abilities exhibited by other psychers. The collapse of the standard template construct systems and the subsequent breakdown of automated navigation technologies created an immediate and critical demand for these rare individuals. As the great stellar networks that had connected human worlds began to fail, colonies found themselves increasingly isolated. Trade routes that had once been maintained by sophisticated AI systems now required human navigators capable of reading the warp's treacherous currents. The Navigator gene, previously a curiosity among the general population, suddenly became humanity's lifeline to maintaining interstellar civilization. During the early stages of the Age of Strife, these proto-navigators operated as independent contractors, selling their services to merchant guilds and colonial administrators desperate to maintain contact with distant worlds. Their abilities varied considerably, with some capable of guiding ships across vast distances, while others possessed only rudimentary warp sight suitable for short-range jumps between nearby systems. The mortality rate among these early practitioners remained extremely high, as the techniques for safely utilizing navigator abilities had not yet been developed. Many died from psychic feedback, temporal displacement, or encounters with warp entities that their untrained minds could not repel. The development of the pineal eye mutation marked a crucial evolutionary step in the Navigator gene's progression. This third eye, typically manifesting as a vertical slit positioned in the center of the forehead, served as the primary organ through which navigators perceived the warp. Unlike the conventional eyes that processed electromagnetic radiation, the pineal eye functioned as a psychic receptor, capable of interpreting the non-Euclidean dimensions of warp space. Early manifestations of this mutation often appeared as mere discolorations or raised areas of skin, gradually developing into the distinctive organ that would become the navigator's most recognizable feature. The connection between the pineal eye and enhanced warp perception proved to be far more complex than initially understood. The organ did not simply allow navigators to see into the warp, it fundamentally altered their perception of reality itself. Through the pineal eye, navigators could observe the Astronomican's guiding light, perceive the emotional resonances that shaped warp currents, and detect the presence of chaos entities before they manifested in real space. This enhanced perception came at a considerable cost, as prolonged use of the pineal eye resulted in progressive mutation, madness, and eventual death from psychic overload. The formation of the first navigator houses emerged as a direct response to the increasing demand for reliable warp travel and the need to preserve the precious navigator bloodlines. As the Age of Strife progressed and interstellar communication became increasingly difficult, successful navigator families began to consolidate their power and influence. These early houses recognized that their genetic heritage represented not merely a survival advantage, but a form of currency more valuable than any material wealth. The ability to navigate the warp safely meant the difference between prosperity and extinction for entire worlds. The establishment of hereditary bloodlines followed naturally from the recognition that navigator abilities were genetically inherited. Families that produced successful navigators jealously guarded their genetic legacy, arranging marriages and alliances designed to strengthen and preserve their psychic gifts. These early breeding programs were crude by later standards, based more on observation and superstition than scientific understanding. Nevertheless, they succeeded in maintaining viable navigator populations during a period when many other human achievements were being lost to the chaos of the Age of Strife. The selective breeding programs developed by the early navigator houses focused primarily on enhancing the strength and stability of the pineal eye mutation. Families that produced navigators with particularly acute warp sight were sought after as marriage partners, while those whose offspring showed signs of genetic degradation found themselves marginalized within navigator society. This process of artificial selection gradually concentrated the navigator gene within specific bloodlines, creating distinct genetic signatures that would later be recognized as the founding lineages of the great navigator houses. The development of these breeding programs also led to the establishment of complex genealogical records that tracked the inheritance patterns of navigator abilities across multiple generations. These records, maintained with religious devotion by house scribes and geneticists, became essential tools for planning marriages and predicting the likelihood of producing viable navigator offspring. The accuracy of these early genetic analyses remained limited, but they provided sufficient guidance to prevent the worst forms of genetic degradation that had plagued some navigator families. As the Age of Strife deepened and conventional forms of government collapsed across much of human space, the navigator houses began to assume political and economic roles that extended far beyond their original function as warp pilots. Their monopoly on interstellar travel made them indispensable to any faction seeking to maintain control over multiple star systems. Merchant princes, warlords, and surviving planetary governors all found themselves dependent on navigator services, creating opportunities for the houses to accumulate wealth and influence on an unprecedented scale. The transformation of navigator families from service providers to political entities fundamentally altered the nature of interstellar commerce during the Age of Strife. Rather than simply hiring navigator services, merchants and traders increasingly found themselves entering into complex contractual relationships with entire houses. These agreements often included provisions for exclusive navigation rights, territorial restrictions, and elaborate systems of mutual obligation that bound both parties for generations. The navigator houses used these contracts to build extensive networks of influence that spanned multiple star systems and connected otherwise isolated human settlements. The increasing political power of the navigator houses also led to the development of their distinctive culture and traditions. Cut off from the broader currents of human civilization by their genetic mutation and specialized role, navigator families began to develop their own customs, rituals, and social hierarchies. These cultural innovations were heavily influenced by their unique relationship with the warp and their position as intermediaries between human settlements scattered across the galaxy. The resulting navigator culture combined elements of aristocratic privilege, mystical tradition, and practical necessity in ways that would persist for millennia. The early navigator houses also began to establish their own military forces and defensive capabilities during this period. As their wealth and influence grew, they became targets for raiders, rival factions, and ambitious warlords seeking to control their services. The houses responded by developing sophisticated security apparatus that included not only conventional military units, but also specialized forces trained to combat psychic threats and warp-based attacks. These early house forces would later evolve into the private armies that the navigator houses maintained throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The relationship between the emerging navigator houses and other psyker populations during the Age of Strife remained complex and often antagonistic. While navigators shared the psychic gift with other human mutants, Their specialized abilities and protected status set them apart from the broader psyker community. Many navigator houses actively distance themselves from other psykers, emphasizing their unique role and genetic purity to maintain their privileged position. This separation was reinforced by the practical differences between navigator abilities and other forms of psychic manifestation, as well as the navigator house's need to maintain their monopoly on warp travel services. The technical knowledge required to safely utilize navigator abilities also began to accumulate within the houses during this period. Through trial and error, navigator families developed techniques for training young psykers to use their pineal eyes without succumbing to madness or psychic overload. These methods included meditation practices, protective rituals, and specialized equipment designed to filter and focus psychic perception. The houses guarded this knowledge jealously, recognizing that their technical expertise was as valuable as their genetic heritage in maintaining their position within human society. The Age of Strife's chaotic conditions also led to the development of the distinctive navigator philosophy regarding their relationship with the warp. Unlike other psykers who often viewed their abilities as either a blessing or a curse, navigators developed a pragmatic understanding of their role as intermediaries between real space and the Immaterium. This philosophical framework emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the acceptance of mutation as necessary costs for maintaining human civilization's interstellar connections. The navigator houses used this philosophy to justify their privileged position and to provide meaning for the suffering that their genetic heritage inevitably entailed. The emergence of the Emperor of Mankind from the depths of Terra's techno-barbarian wars fundamentally transformed the relationship between the navigator houses and human civilization. Where the Age of Strife had seen the houses operate as independent power brokers serving fragmented human factions, the Emperor's vision of reunified humanity demanded a more systematic approach to interstellar navigation. The scattered navigator families, who had spent millennia developing their own territories and spheres of influence, suddenly found themselves confronted by a singular authority capable of either incorporating them into his grand design or potentially replacing them entirely. The Emperor's initial encounters with navigator representatives occurred during the final phases of the Unification Wars, as his forces consolidated control over Terra's remaining holdouts. Several navigator houses maintained enclaves within the solar system, having established themselves as essential intermediaries for trade between Terra, Mars, and the outer system colonies. These houses had survived the Age of Strife by carefully managing their relationships with various Terran factions, never committing fully to any single power while ensuring their services remained indispensable to interplanetary commerce. The recognition of navigator capabilities as essential to his galactic conquest became apparent to the Emperor during the early planning stages of what would become the Great Crusade. His strategic vision encompassed not merely the conquest of nearby star systems, but the systematic reclamation of human worlds scattered across the entire galaxy. Such an undertaking required navigation capabilities far beyond what conventional warp travel could provide. The Emperor's own psychic abilities, while vastly superior to any human psyker, were needed for other aspects of his grand design, making the Navigator House's specialized talents irreplaceable for the practical execution of galactic conquest. The Treaty of Luna represented the culmination of extensive negotiations between the Emperor's representatives and the assembled Navigator Houses. The location itself held symbolic significance, as Luna had served as neutral ground during the final stages of the Unification Wars and represented the first step in humanity's expansion beyond Terra. The treaty negotiations required careful balancing of the Emperor's need for navigator services against the House's determination to maintain their independence and traditional privileges. The formal recognition of navigator houses as essential partners in the Emperor's vision came with specific guarantees that addressed their primary concerns about integration into the emerging imperial hierarchy. The treaty established that navigator houses would retain their internal autonomy, including their traditional rights to arrange marriages, maintain private military forces, and govern their own territories according to established house customs. These provisions recognized that the Navigator gene's stability depended on carefully maintained bloodlines that could not be subjected to external interference without risking the degradation of their essential abilities. The exemption of navigators from standard anti-psyker legislation represented perhaps the most significant concession in the treaty. While the emperor's policies toward other psykers remained restrictive and often punitive, the navigator houses received explicit protection from persecution based on their psychic abilities. This exemption extended beyond the navigators themselves to include their immediate families and house retainers, creating a protected class within imperial society that enjoyed privileges unavailable to other psyker populations. The establishment of territorial rights for navigator houses within the treaty framework acknowledged their existing spheres of influence while providing mechanisms for expansion as the Great Crusade progressed. Each major house received recognition of their traditional territories, including established trade routes, client relationships, and exclusive navigation contracts. The treaty also created procedures for houses to claim new territories as imperial forces conquered previously unknown human worlds, ensuring that navigator interests would be protected during the rapid expansion phase of the Great Crusade. The creation of the Paternova position emerged from the emperor's recognition that effective coordination of navigator resources required centralized leadership that could speak for all houses while maintaining their internal autonomy. The Paternova would serve as the supreme authority over navigator affairs, possessing the power to mediate disputes between houses, allocate navigation assignments for major imperial expeditions, and represent navigator interests in dealings with other imperial institutions. This position combined spiritual authority over navigator traditions with practical political power over house resources and capabilities. The selection of the first Paternova involved complex negotiations among the major navigator houses, each of which possessed legitimate claims to leadership based on their genetic purity, territorial holdings, or historical achievements. The emperor's involvement in these discussions remained indirect but decisive, as his approval was necessary for any candidate to achieve universal recognition among the houses. The chosen Paternova needed to demonstrate not only exceptional navigator abilities, but also the political acumen necessary to balance competing house interests while serving imperial objectives. The spiritual dimensions of the Paternova's role reflected the unique position of navigators within imperial society. Unlike other imperial offices that derived their authority from administrative appointment or military achievement, the Paternova's legitimacy stemmed from their embodiment of navigator genetic and cultural traditions. This spiritual authority included responsibility for maintaining the religious practices that had developed within navigator society, overseeing the training of young navigators, and preserving the technical knowledge essential to safe warp travel. The integration of navigator houses into the emerging imperial hierarchy required careful consideration of their relationship with other imperial institutions. The Adeptus Mechanicus, with their control over shipbuilding and technical resources, represented natural allies for the navigator houses, as both organizations possessed specialized knowledge essential to imperial expansion. The treaty established protocols for cooperation between navigator houses and Mechanicus Forge worlds, ensuring that ship construction programs would incorporate navigator requirements and that technical innovations would be shared between the two groups. The relationship between navigator houses and the developing imperial military structure proved more complex, as the house's traditional independence conflicted with military requirements for unified command and control. The treaty addressed these concerns by establishing that navigator houses would provide their services to imperial expeditions while maintaining their internal command structures and operational autonomy. This arrangement allowed house navigators to serve imperial objectives while preserving their traditional methods and maintaining loyalty to their genetic families. the rapid expansion of the Great Crusade created unprecedented opportunities for navigator houses to expand their influence and accumulate wealth. The emperor's expeditionary fleets required navigator services on a scale never before attempted, as hundreds of fleets simultaneously pushed outward from Terra to reclaim human worlds across the galaxy. This massive undertaking strained navigator resources to their limits, while providing opportunities for houses to establish new territories and client relationships throughout the expanding imperial domain. The logistical challenges of supporting the Great Crusade's navigation requirements led to significant innovations in navigator deployment and resource management. The traditional model of individual navigators serving specific vessels or trade routes proved inadequate for the scale of imperial expansion. Instead, navigator houses developed new organizational structures that allowed them to deploy their resources more efficiently, including the creation of navigator cadres assigned to specific expeditionary fleets and the establishment of training facilities capable of producing navigators in greater numbers. The establishment of navigator enclaves on newly conquered worlds became a standard practice during the Great Crusade, as houses sought to secure their positions within the expanding imperial territory. These enclaves served multiple functions, providing secure bases for navigator operations, centers for training new generations of house members, and political strongholds that could influence local imperial administration. The creation of these facilities required careful negotiation with local authorities and often involved significant investment in defensive capabilities to protect navigator assets from potential threats. The interaction between navigator houses and the Space Marine legions during the Great Crusade created both opportunities and tensions within the imperial hierarchy. The legion's aggressive expansion schedules and military priorities sometimes conflicted with navigator concerns about safety and resource allocation. However, the mutual dependence between these two groups led to the development of working relationships that balanced military objectives with navigator capabilities. Some houses developed particular expertise in supporting specific legions, creating partnerships that persisted throughout the Great Crusade and beyond. The discovery of previously unknown navigator bloodlines on rediscovered human worlds presented both opportunities and challenges for the established houses. Some worlds that had been isolated since the Age of Strife had developed their own navigator populations, often with genetic variations or cultural practices that differed significantly from the Terran houses. The integration of these populations required careful evaluation of their abilities and genetic compatibility, as well as negotiation of their status within the existing house hierarchy. The expansion of navigator influence during the Great Crusade also led to increased scrutiny of their activities by other imperial institutions. The Imperium's growing bureaucracy included officials responsible for monitoring navigator compliance with treaty obligations and ensuring that house activities supported imperial objectives. This oversight created new forms of political pressure on navigator houses, as they needed to balance their traditional independence with the requirements of imperial service. The development of specialized navigator vessels during the Great Crusade represented a significant technological advancement that enhanced their capabilities while reinforcing their essential role in imperial expansion. These ships, designed specifically to accommodate navigator requirements and optimize their performance, featured enhanced shielding systems, specialized navigation chambers, and improved life support systems designed to protect navigator crews during extended warp transits. The construction of these vessels required close cooperation between navigator houses, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and imperial shipyards, creating new forms of technical collaboration that would influence starship design for millennia. The Great Crusade's success in reconnecting human worlds across the galaxy vindicated the Emperor's decision to integrate navigator houses into the imperial hierarchy rather than attempting to replace them with alternative technologies. The speed and efficiency of imperial expansion depended directly on navigator capabilities, as conventional warp travel could never have supported the simultaneous operations of hundreds of expeditionary fleets across such vast distances. The Navigator House's successful performance during this period secured their position within imperial society and established precedents for their continued autonomy that would persist long after the Great Crusade's conclusion. The establishment of the Paternova as the supreme authority over all Navigator houses represented one of the most significant developments in the organization of the Navis Nobilite during the early imperial period. This position emerged not merely as an administrative necessity, but as a spiritual and genetic embodiment of Navigator unity, combining ancient traditions with the practical requirements of governing a scattered and often fractious collection of noble houses. The Paternova's role transcended conventional political leadership, encompassing prophetic abilities that allowed them to perceive potential futures through the chaotic currents of the warp itself. The prophetic capabilities of the Paternova manifested through an enhanced form of the Navigator mutation that appeared only in individuals possessing the purest genetic lineages from multiple house bloodlines. Unlike the focused warp sight of ordinary navigators, the Paternova's perception extended beyond immediate navigation requirements to encompass broader patterns of possibility and probability within the Immaterium. This enhanced ability allowed them to foresee potential threats to navigator interests, identify opportunities for expansion, and guide the overall strategic direction of the Navis Nobilite across decades or even centuries. The cyclical nature of the Paternova's existence remained one of the most closely guarded mysteries within Navigator society. Historical records suggested that the position followed a pattern of death and rebirth that defied conventional understanding of mortality and succession. The Paternova would serve for a period typically lasting several centuries before undergoing a transformation that resulted in their apparent death, only to return in a new incarnation that retained the memories and essential characteristics of their predecessor while possessing a renewed physical form. This regenerative cycle appeared to be connected to the Paternova's intense exposure to warp energies during their prophetic activities. The constant strain of perceiving multiple potential futures simultaneously caused progressive mutation and physical degradation that would eventually prove fatal to any ordinary navigator. However, the unique genetic heritage of the Paternova bloodline included mechanisms that allowed for cellular regeneration and consciousness transfer that enabled them to survive this process and emerge renewed. The exact nature of these mechanisms remained unknown even to the most learned navigator geneticists, who regarded the phenomenon as a manifestation of the Emperor's blessing upon their species. The selection process for each new Paternova incarnation involved complex rituals and genetic testing that could take decades to complete. Representatives from all major navigator houses participated in these ceremonies, which included detailed analysis of potential candidates' bloodline purity, psychic capabilities, and compatibility with the existing Paternova consciousness. The process required unanimous agreement among the House representatives, ensuring that each new Paternova possessed the legitimacy necessary to command obedience from all branches of the Navis Nobilite. The major navigator houses that emerged during the Great Crusade period established the fundamental structure of navigator society that would persist throughout imperial history. House Belisarius, one of the most ancient and influential of these bloodlines, traced their origins to the earliest navigator families of Terra and maintained extensive territories throughout the core imperial worlds. Their genetic heritage included some of the most stable navigator mutations, producing individuals capable of guiding vessels across vast distances with exceptional accuracy and minimal risk of psychic degradation. House Belisarius specialized in long-range exploration and maintained exclusive contracts with several Space Marine chapters for deep space reconnaissance missions. Their navigators possessed enhanced resistance to warp exposure, allowing them to undertake extended voyages that would prove fatal to members of other houses. This capability made them invaluable for establishing new trade routes and maintaining contact with distant imperial outposts. The house's territorial holdings included several fortress worlds strategically positioned along major warp routes, providing secure bases for their operations and serving as training centers for new generations of House members. House Nostromo emerged as a significant power during the later stages of the Great Crusade, establishing their influence through strategic alliances with rogue trader dynasties and merchant guilds. Their genetic heritage emphasized enhanced perception of warp currents and emotional resonances, making them particularly effective at navigating the treacherous passages near areas of high psychic activity. House Nostromo's territories included several hive worlds where they maintained extensive commercial operations, using their wealth to fund exploration expeditions and acquire new technologies that enhanced their navigation capabilities. The rivalry between House Nostromo and House Belisarius stemmed from competing claims over lucrative trade routes connecting the core imperial worlds with the expanding frontier territories. Both houses possessed legitimate historical claims to these routes, leading to centuries of legal disputes and occasional armed conflicts between their respective military forces. These tensions were exacerbated by fundamental differences in their approaches to navigator duties, with House Belisarius emphasizing traditional methods and conservative breeding practices, while House Nostromo pursued more aggressive expansion strategies and experimental genetic enhancement programs. House Raven distinguished itself through their specialization in military navigation and their close relationships with Imperial Navy commands. Their genetic heritage produced navigators with exceptional combat reflexes and enhanced ability to perceive hostile psychic emanations, making them ideal for supporting naval operations in contested systems. House Raven maintained fortress monasteries on several key naval bases, where they trained specialized navigator warriors capable of functioning effectively in combat situations while maintaining their essential navigation duties. The territorial holdings of House Raven reflected their military focus, consisting primarily of fortified installations positioned to support Imperial Navy operations rather than commercial enterprises. These facilities included advanced defensive systems and specialized training grounds where House members practiced combat techniques alongside their navigation studies. House Raven's military traditions emphasized honor, duty, and sacrifice, creating a warrior culture that set them apart from the more commercially oriented houses while earning them respect throughout the imperial military hierarchy. The complex system of bloodline purity ratings developed by the Navigator houses represented one of their most sophisticated achievements in genetic monitoring and selective breeding. These ratings classified individual navigators according to the strength and stability of their mutations, their resistance to warp exposure, and their potential for producing viable offspring. The system used a numerical scale that incorporated multiple factors, including the clarity of pineal eye development, the accuracy of warp perception, and the absence of degenerative mutations that could compromise navigator abilities. The highest purity ratings were reserved for individuals whose genetic heritage could be traced through multiple generations of successful navigators without evidence of mutation degradation or psychic instability. These individuals commanded premium prices in marriage negotiations and were often sought after by multiple houses seeking to strengthen their own bloodlines. The competition for high-purity marriage partners created a complex social hierarchy within Navigator society, where genetic heritage determined not only individual status, but also the relative power and influence of entire house branches. Marriage contracts between Navigator houses involved extensive negotiations that could span years or even decades, as representatives from both families analyzed genetic compatibility, territorial implications, and potential political ramifications. These contracts typically included detailed provisions regarding the upbringing and education of potential offspring, the distribution of territorial rights, and the allocation of navigation assignments that would affect both houses' interests. The complexity of these arrangements required specialized legal experts who understood both navigator customs and imperial law. The genetic monitoring systems employed by navigator houses included sophisticated testing procedures that could detect potential mutations and genetic instabilities before they manifested as visible symptoms. These systems used both technological analysis and psychic evaluation to assess individual genetic potential and predict the likelihood of successful navigator development in offspring. The data collected through these procedures was carefully maintained in house archives that represented some of the most comprehensive genetic records in the Imperium. The enforcement of genetic purity standards within Navigator society created significant social pressures that affected all aspects of house life. Individuals whose genetic heritage fell below acceptable standards found themselves marginalized within their own houses, often relegated to support roles or excluded from important family decisions. This system of genetic stratification was justified by the practical necessity of maintaining navigator abilities, but it also created internal tensions that sometimes erupted into open conflicts between different branches of the same house. The political machinations between navigator houses for influence within the broader imperial hierarchy involved complex strategies that combined commercial competition, territorial disputes, and ideological differences. Houses competed for exclusive contracts with major imperial institutions, including the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Navy, and various Space Marine chapters. These contracts provided not only substantial financial rewards, but also political influence that could be leveraged to secure favorable treatment in disputes with rival houses. The control of lucrative shipping routes represented one of the most important aspects of inter-house competition, as these routes provided steady income streams that funded house operations and expansion activities. The most valuable routes connected major industrial worlds with frontier territories, carrying essential supplies and manufactured goods that supported imperial expansion. Houses that controlled these routes could influence the development of entire sectors by determining which worlds received priority access to trade networks and which remained isolated from imperial commerce. The establishment of trade agreements between navigator houses and various imperial factions required careful negotiation of terms that balanced short-term profits with long-term strategic considerations. These agreements often included provisions for exclusive navigation rights, territorial access, and mutual defense obligations that created complex webs of alliance and obligation throughout the navigator community. The most successful houses developed extensive networks of such agreements that provided them with multiple sources of income and political support. The competition for influence within imperial institutions led to the development of sophisticated lobbying efforts by navigator houses, who maintained representatives at major imperial centers to advocate for their interests and monitor potential threats to their position. These representatives combined traditional diplomatic skills with intimate knowledge of navigator capabilities and limitations, allowing them to effectively communicate house positions to imperial officials who might otherwise lack understanding of navigator concerns. The accumulation of wealth through successful navigation contracts allowed the major houses to invest in military capabilities that enhanced their ability to protect their interests and project power throughout their territories. These private military forces included not only conventional troops, but also specialized units trained to combat psychic threats and operate in environments affected by warp phenomena. The most powerful houses maintained fleets of armed vessels capable of independent operations, creating military capabilities that rivaled those of some Imperial Navy commands. The physical transformation that marks an individual as a navigator begins subtly during adolescence, manifesting initially as minor deviations from baseline human appearance that gradually intensify throughout their lifetime. The most immediately recognizable of these mutations is the distinctive pallor that affects all navigator bloodlines, creating a skin tone that ranges from alabaster white to a sickly gray-green hue depending on the specific genetic heritage of their house. This pale coloration results from the navigator's altered physiology, which processes certain proteins and minerals differently than normal humans, leading to reduced melanin production and changes in blood chemistry that affect skin pigmentation. The development of elongated limbs represents another common navigator mutation, with affected individuals displaying arms and legs that appear disproportionately long compared to their torso. This skeletal modification often begins during the growth spurts of adolescence, when navigator children may experience periods of rapid bone extension that can be extremely painful and require specialized medical intervention. The resulting limb proportions create a distinctly alien appearance that becomes more pronounced with age, as the bones continue to lengthen slowly throughout the navigator's adult life. The cranial modifications associated with navigator genetics produce some of the most distinctive physical characteristics of the mutation. Navigator skulls typically develop an elongated shape, with the forehead extending backward to accommodate the enlarged brain structures necessary for processing warp-based sensory information. This cranial extension often creates a pronounced ridge along the top of the skull, giving navigators a distinctly non-human profile that becomes more apparent as they age. The bone structure around the eye sockets also undergoes modification, creating deeper recesses that can give navigators a hollow, haunted appearance even when their conventional eyes remain healthy. The pineal eye itself represents the most crucial and dangerous aspect of navigator anatomy, developing as a vertical slit positioned in the center of the forehead during the individual's teenage years. The formation of this organ involves the migration of specialized neural tissue from deep within the brain to a position just beneath the skin, where it forms connections with both the nervous system and the navigator's psychic centers. The process of pineal eye development is invariably painful and can last for months, during which the young navigator experiences severe headaches, visual disturbances, and psychic sensitivity that requires careful medical monitoring. The fully developed pineal eye appears as a vertical opening approximately 2 to 3 centimeters in length, surrounded by delicate skin that often displays unusual coloration or texture. The eye itself contains structures that bear little resemblance to conventional human ocular anatomy, featuring crystalline formations that focus psychic energy and specialized neural clusters that process warp-based information. The interior of the pineal eye often displays colors that shift and change depending on the navigator's emotional state and the intensity of local warp activity, ranging from deep purple to brilliant gold, or disturbing combinations of hues that have no equivalent in normal human vision. The protective mechanisms that shield the pineal eye from constant warp exposure include both physical and psychic barriers that develop naturally as part of the navigator mutation. The skin surrounding the eye contains specialized cells that can contract to seal the opening completely, creating a protective barrier that prevents unwanted psychic intrusion during periods when the navigator is not actively using their abilities. This natural shielding is supplemented by learned techniques that allow experienced navigators to create additional psychic barriers around their third eye, reducing the risk of accidental exposure to dangerous warp phenomena. The rituals required for safe warp observation have evolved over millennia of navigator tradition, combining practical protective measures with spiritual practices that help maintain the navigator's mental stability during extended periods of warp sight. These rituals typically begin with meditation exercises designed to center the navigator's consciousness and prepare their mind for the disorienting experience of perceiving non-Euclidean space. The navigator must achieve a state of controlled detachment that allows them to observe warp currents without becoming emotionally involved in the chaotic energies they encounter. The physical preparation for warp observation includes the application of specialized oils and unguents around the pineal eye, substances that contain psychoactive compounds derived from rare plants and minerals found only on specific worlds within navigator territories. These preparations help to enhance the eye's sensitivity while providing additional protection against psychic contamination. The exact composition of these substances varies between different navigator houses, with each bloodline maintaining their own secret formulations that have been refined over generations of use. The chamber used for warp observation must be carefully prepared according to ancient traditions that combine practical safety measures with symbolic elements designed to reinforce the navigator's mental defenses. The walls of these chambers are typically lined with materials that provide psychic insulation, including specially treated metals and stones that naturally resist warp influence. The floor is often inscribed with geometric patterns that serve both as focusing aids for the navigator's concentration and as symbolic representations of the ordered universe that exists beyond the chaos of the Immaterium. The actual process of opening the pineal eye for warp observation requires precise control and timing, as premature or excessive exposure can result in permanent damage to the navigator's psychic abilities or even death from psychic shock. The navigator must gradually increase their level of warp sight, beginning with brief glimpses of the Immaterium's surface currents before progressing to deeper levels of perception that reveal the underlying structure of warp space. This process can take hours to complete safely, during which the navigator must maintain constant awareness of their mental state and be prepared to withdraw immediately if they detect signs of psychic contamination or demonic attention. The progressive physical changes that occur as navigators age and accumulate warp exposure create a visible record of their service to the Imperium. The skin becomes increasingly translucent with age, revealing the network of blood vessels beneath and creating a fragile, almost ethereal appearance that becomes more pronounced with each decade of active service. The veins themselves often display unusual coloration, appearing as dark purple or blue-black lines that create intricate patterns across the navigator's exposed skin. The development of additional mutations during a navigator's career depends largely on the intensity and frequency of their warp exposure, with those who undertake particularly dangerous or extended voyages showing more rapid and severe physical changes. These secondary mutations can include the growth of vestigial organs, changes in bone density that make the skeleton increasingly brittle, and alterations to the nervous system that can affect motor control and sensory perception. Some elderly navigators develop a condition known as warp sight, where their conventional eyes begin to display the same unusual coloration as their pineal eye, creating a disturbing appearance that can be unsettling even to other navigators. The mental changes that accompany prolonged warp exposure are often more subtle but equally significant, affecting the navigator's personality, memory, and ability to relate to normal humans. Extended periods of perceiving the Immaterium's chaotic energies can lead to a condition known as temporal displacement, where the navigator begins to experience difficulty distinguishing between past, present, and future events. This condition manifests as confusion about chronology, unexpected knowledge of future events, and occasional episodes where the navigator appears to be responding to stimuli that are not present in real space. The development of enhanced psychic sensitivity represents both a benefit and a curse for aging navigators, as their increased ability to perceive warp phenomena comes at the cost of greater vulnerability to psychic attack and emotional instability. Elderly navigators often report experiencing the emotions and thoughts of individuals around them, creating a form of involuntary telepathy that can be overwhelming in crowded environments. This sensitivity also extends to their ability to detect the presence of other psychers, chaos cultists, and demonic entities, making them valuable assets for Imperial security forces despite the personal cost of their enhanced abilities. The hereditary nature of navigator abilities creates complex patterns of inheritance that navigator houses have studied intensively for millennia. The navigator gene appears to be dominant in most cases, meaning that children of navigator parents have a high probability of developing the mutation themselves. However, the expression of navigator abilities is influenced by numerous factors, including the genetic compatibility of the parents, environmental conditions during pregnancy, and exposure to warp energies during fetal development. The genetic instability inherent in navigator bloodlines manifests in several ways, with stillbirths representing one of the most common and tragic consequences of the mutation. Navigator pregnancies experience significantly higher rates of fetal mortality compared to baseline human reproduction, with many pregnancies ending in miscarriage during the crucial developmental period when the pineal eye begins to form. The surviving children often display a range of genetic abnormalities that can affect their viability as functional navigators, including malformed pineal eyes, insufficient psychic sensitivity, or excessive mutation that makes them unsuitable for warp navigation duties. The birth of non-navigator offspring to navigator parents represents a particular source of concern for the houses, as these individuals lack the essential abilities that define their bloodline while still carrying the genetic markers that identify them as navigator descendants. These blanks, or nulls, as they are sometimes called within navigator society, often face discrimination and marginalization within their own families, despite their otherwise normal human capabilities. Some houses have developed specialized roles for these individuals, utilizing their genetic heritage and family connections while acknowledging their inability to serve as active navigators. The phenomenon of genetic reversion, where navigator bloodlines gradually lose their psychic abilities over successive generations, represents an existential threat to individual houses and the Navis Nobilite as a whole. This process typically begins with subtle reductions in warp sight clarity and pineal eye sensitivity, progressing over several generations until the affected bloodline can no longer produce functional navigators. The causes of genetic reversion remain poorly understood, but appear to be related to accumulated genetic damage from warp exposure, inbreeding within isolated house populations, and the natural tendency of extreme mutations to revert toward baseline human genetics over time. The monitoring systems developed by navigator houses to track genetic stability include detailed genealogical records that trace bloodline purity across dozens of generations, identifying patterns of inheritance and predicting the likelihood of successful navigator development in future offspring. These records are maintained with religious devotion by house geneticists and archivists, who use sophisticated analysis techniques to identify potential genetic problems before they manifest as visible symptoms. The data collected through these monitoring efforts influences every aspect of house breeding programs, from marriage arrangements to the allocation of resources for genetic enhancement research. The physical toll of navigator service extends beyond the visible mutations to include internal changes that affect organ function, immune system response, and overall life expectancy. The constant exposure to warp energies gradually breaks down cellular structures throughout the navigator's body, leading to premature aging and increased susceptibility to various diseases and conditions. The liver and kidneys, which process the toxins produced by warp exposure, often show signs of damage after decades of active service, while the cardiovascular system may develop abnormalities that affect blood flow and cardiac function. The neurological changes associated with navigator aging create unique challenges for medical treatment, as the brain structures responsible for warp perception become increasingly integrated with conventional neural pathways. Elderly navigators may experience seizures, memory loss, and cognitive dysfunction that results from the breakdown of the specialized neural tissue that enables their psychic abilities. These conditions are often irreversible and can progress rapidly once they begin, making the management of aging navigator populations a constant concern for house medical staff and family members. The technical process of warp navigation represents one of the most complex and dangerous undertakings in the Imperium, requiring navigators to interpret the chaotic currents of the Immaterium while maintaining their sanity and guiding massive starships through dimensions that defy conventional physics. The reading of warp currents begins with the navigator's careful observation of the psychic emanations that flow through the warp like invisible rivers of energy, each carrying distinct emotional resonances and temporal distortions that must be analyzed and interpreted before any navigation decisions can be made. These currents shift constantly, influenced by the collective psychic emanations of entire populations, the presence of powerful psychers, and the activities of chaos entities that inhabit the deeper regions of the Immaterium. The navigator's perception of warp currents appears as a constantly shifting tapestry of colors, textures, and geometric patterns that bear no resemblance to anything experienced in real space. Stable currents manifest as flowing streams of consistent coloration and movement, indicating safe passages that can carry a vessel toward its intended destination with minimal risk of temporal displacement or encounter with hostile entities. These stable currents are relatively rare and highly prized by experienced navigators, who maintain detailed mental maps of their locations and characteristics based on years of careful observation and analysis. Unstable currents present themselves as chaotic swirls of conflicting colors and erratic movement patterns that indicate areas of extreme danger where the normal laws of physics break down entirely. These regions can trap vessels in temporal loops, transport them vast distances from their intended destinations, or expose them to direct attack by the denizens of the warp. The identification of unstable currents requires exceptional skill and experience, as their appearance can change rapidly and without warning, forcing navigators to make split-second decisions that determine the fate of their entire vessel and crew. The emotional resonances carried by warp currents provide crucial information about the psychic conditions that created them and the potential dangers they may contain. Currents influenced by fear and despair often lead toward regions where violent conflicts have occurred or where chaos cults have established strongholds, while those carrying resonances of hope and determination may indicate the presence of imperial forces or loyal populations. The navigator must learn to distinguish between these different emotional signatures while avoiding becoming emotionally involved in the experiences that created them, as such involvement can lead to psychic contamination or loss of navigational focus. The identification of safe passages through the warp requires the navigator to synthesize information from multiple sources, including the appearance and behavior of warp currents, the intensity of local psychic emanations, and the presence or absence of the Astronomican's guiding light. Safe passages typically follow routes where multiple stable currents converge, creating channels of relatively calm warp space that allow for predictable travel times and reduced exposure to dangerous phenomena. These passages are often narrow and require precise navigation to maintain, as deviation from the optimal path can quickly lead a vessel into hazardous regions where survival becomes uncertain. The process of identifying safe passages also involves careful timing, as the warp's chaotic nature means that routes that are safe at one moment may become deadly traps within hours or even minutes. Experienced navigators develop an intuitive sense for the rhythm of warp currents, learning to recognize the patterns that indicate when a passage is likely to remain stable and when it may collapse or shift direction. This temporal awareness requires constant vigilance and the ability to make rapid course corrections based on subtle changes in the warp's behavior that less experienced navigators might miss entirely. The avoidance of warp storms represents one of the most critical aspects of navigator training, as these massive disturbances can destroy entire fleets and render vast regions of space impassable for decades or even centuries. Warp storms appear to navigator perception as towering walls of chaotic energy that dwarf even the largest imperial vessels, filled with lightning like discharges of pure psychic force and inhabited by entities that exist only within the storm's turbulent embrace. The approach of a warp storm creates distinctive warning signs that experienced navigators learn to recognize, including sudden changes in current direction, increasing emotional intensity in local psychic emanations, and the appearance of unusual colors or patterns in the warp's fabric. The early detection of warp storms requires navigators to maintain constant awareness of conditions far beyond their immediate vicinity, scanning the psychic horizon for signs of disturbance that might indicate an approaching storm system. This long-range perception is extremely taxing and can only be maintained for limited periods without risking exhaustion or psychic overload. The navigator must balance the need for early warning against the physical and mental costs of extended warp observation, making strategic decisions about when to risk deeper perception and when to rely on more limited but safer scanning techniques. The critical relationship between navigators and the Astronomican forms the foundation of all long-distance Imperial warp travel, as this psychic lighthouse provides the only reliable reference point for navigation across the vast distances that separate human worlds. The Astronomican appears to navigator perception as a brilliant beacon of golden light that cuts through the chaos of the warp like a sword, its steady radiance providing both directional guidance and a measure of protection against the predations of chaos entities. The light's intensity varies depending on the navigator's distance from Terra and the local conditions within the warp, but its presence remains detectable across most of the galaxy's inhabited regions. The Emperor's role in maintaining the Astronomican creates a direct connection between every navigator and the master of mankind himself, as each time they observe the psychic lighthouse, they are perceiving a manifestation of his incredible psychic power. This connection is both a blessing and a burden for navigators, as exposure to the Emperor's psychic emanations can provide enhanced clarity and protection during dangerous passages, while also creating an overwhelming sense of awe and responsibility that some navigators find difficult to bear. The most experienced navigators learn to draw strength from this connection while maintaining their emotional equilibrium, using the Emperor's presence as an anchor point for their own psychic stability. The Astronomican's guidance allows navigators to plot courses across distances that would otherwise be impossible to traverse safely, providing reference points that enable them to maintain their bearings even during extended voyages through the most chaotic regions of warp space. The lighthouse's beam creates a form of psychic coordinate system that navigators use to calculate their position and plot courses toward distant destinations, compensating for the warp's tendency to distort space and time in ways that make conventional navigation techniques useless. The interpretation of the Astronomican signals requires specialized training that goes beyond basic navigator education, as the lighthouse's emanations contain complex information about galactic conditions, Imperial activities, and potential threats that must be decoded and analyzed. Experienced navigators can detect subtle variations in the Astronomican's intensity and coloration that indicate changes in the Emperor's condition, major military campaigns, or the presence of significant chaos incursions that might affect navigation safety. This information is invaluable for planning long-distance voyages and avoiding regions where Imperial authority has been compromised or where chaos forces have established strongholds. The limitations of navigator sight create significant constraints on Imperial expansion and military operations, as even the most skilled navigators cannot perceive warp conditions beyond a certain range without risking permanent damage to their psychic abilities. The maximum effective range for navigator perception varies depending on the individual's training, genetic heritage, and accumulated experience, but rarely exceeds several light years even under optimal conditions. This limitation means that long-distance voyages must be planned as a series of shorter jumps, with the navigator reassessing conditions and plotting new courses at regular intervals throughout the journey. The factors that determine maximum range include the clarity of the navigator's pineal eye, the stability of local warp conditions, and the presence of psychic interference from various sources including other psychers, chaos entities, and areas of high emotional resonance. Navigators with particularly pure genetic heritage and extensive training may achieve slightly greater range than their peers, but the fundamental limitations of human psychic perception ensure that even the most capable individuals cannot exceed certain absolute boundaries without risking catastrophic consequences. The dangers of extended warp exposure accumulate gradually over the course of a navigator's career, creating progressive deterioration in their physical and mental condition that ultimately limits their working lifespan. The constant strain of perceiving the warp's chaotic energies causes cellular damage throughout the navigator's body, with the brain and nervous system bearing the greatest burden as they process information that human physiology was never designed to handle. This damage manifests as headaches, vision problems, memory loss, and progressive mutation that can eventually render the navigator unable to perform their duties safely. The psychological effects of extended warp exposure include increased susceptibility to depression, anxiety, and psychotic episodes that result from prolonged contact with the Immaterium's chaotic influences. Many navigators develop obsessive behaviors, paranoid delusions, or dissociative disorders that interfere with their ability to maintain the mental discipline required for safe navigation. The most severe cases involve complete psychological breakdown, where the navigator loses the ability to distinguish between warp perceptions and reality, making them a danger to themselves and their crew. The need for rest periods between journeys represents a crucial aspect of navigator health management, as the human psyche requires time to recover from the disorienting effects of warp exposure and process the alien experiences encountered during transit. The duration of required rest periods varies depending on the length and difficulty of the previous voyage, with longer or more dangerous journeys requiring correspondingly extended recovery times. Navigators who attempt to undertake consecutive voyages without adequate rest face rapidly increasing risks of psychic breakdown, navigation errors, and permanent damage to their abilities. The calculation of appropriate rest periods involves careful assessment of the navigator's physical and mental condition, taking into account factors such as their age, experience level, genetic stability, and the specific challenges encountered during their most recent voyage. House medical staff use sophisticated monitoring techniques to evaluate navigator health, including psychic resonance scans, neurological examinations, and genetic stability assessments that help determine when an individual is ready to return to active duty. The collaboration between navigators, astropaths, and Geller field technicians represents one of the most crucial aspects of safe warp travel, as each group contributes essential capabilities that complement and enhance the other's effectiveness. Astropaths provide long-range communication capabilities that allow vessels to maintain contact with Imperial authorities and coordinate with other ships during extended voyages, while also serving as early warning systems for psychic threats that might escape the navigator's attention. Their ability to detect and interpret psychic emanations from different sources provides valuable intelligence about conditions along planned routes and potential dangers that might affect navigation safety. The relationship between navigators and astropaths requires careful coordination to avoid psychic interference that could compromise either individual's effectiveness. Both groups possess powerful psychic abilities that can create unwanted resonances if not properly managed, potentially disrupting navigation accuracy or communication clarity. Experienced crews develop protocols for managing these interactions, including designated operating schedules that minimize conflicts and emergency procedures for situations where both capabilities must be used simultaneously despite the risks involved. Geller field technicians maintain the protective barriers that shield vessels from direct contact with warp entities and prevent the Immaterium's chaotic energies from directly affecting the ship's crew and systems. The proper functioning of these fields is essential for navigator safety, as they provide the stable environment necessary for accurate warp perception while protecting the navigator from psychic attacks that could prove fatal. The technicians must maintain constant vigilance during warp transit, monitoring field strength and stability while making adjustments to compensate for changing conditions and potential equipment failures. The coordination between navigators and Geller field technicians involves continuous communication about field status and navigation requirements, as changes in course or speed can affect field stability while field fluctuations can impact navigation accuracy. The navigator must understand the technical limitations of the Geller field systems and plan their navigation accordingly, avoiding maneuvers that might overload the generators or create dangerous gaps in protection. Similarly, the technicians must be aware of the navigator's requirements and ensure that field configurations provide optimal conditions for warp perception without compromising overall vessel safety. The integration of these three specialties creates a complex web of interdependence that requires exceptional coordination and mutual trust among all participants. The failure of any single component can compromise the entire mission, making crew selection and training crucial factors in the success of Imperial warp travel. The most effective crews develop almost telepathic coordination, with each member anticipating the other's needs and responding to changing conditions with practiced efficiency that can mean the difference between safe arrival and catastrophic loss. The political machinery of the Imperium operates through a complex web of ancient agreements, territorial claims, and mutual obligations that bind the Navigator houses to the broader imperial hierarchy while preserving their essential autonomy. The High Lords of Terra, representing the supreme authority of imperial governance, maintain carefully structured relationships with the major Navigator houses that acknowledge their indispensable role in maintaining the Imperium's interstellar communications and transportation networks. These relationships extend far beyond simple service contracts, encompassing territorial rights, judicial authority, and political representation that grants Navigator houses influence over imperial policy decisions affecting trade, exploration, and military deployment. The representation of Navigator interests within the High Lords of Terra operates through the Office of the Puternova, whose position grants them direct access to the highest levels of imperial decision-making. This representation ensures that Navigator concerns receive consideration during policy discussions that might affect their operations, territorial holdings, or genetic preservation programs. The Puternova's influence extends beyond mere advocacy, as their prophetic abilities provide the High Lords with strategic intelligence about potential future developments that could impact imperial stability and expansion efforts. The major Navigator houses maintain permanent diplomatic missions on Terra, staffed by experienced negotiators who understand both imperial bureaucracy and the complex internal politics of the Navis Nobilite. These missions serve as intelligence-gathering operations, monitoring imperial policy developments and identifying opportunities for their respective houses to expand their influence or secure favorable treatment in upcoming legislation. The diplomatic staff includes specialists in various aspects of imperial law, trade regulation, and military procurement, allowing them to provide comprehensive analysis of how proposed changes might affect Navigator interests. The influence wielded by Navigator houses in shaping imperial trade policy stems from their monopoly on safe interstellar transportation, which gives them effective veto power over proposed regulations that might compromise their operations or profitability. Imperial administrators must consider Navigator capabilities and limitations when developing trade agreements, establishing new shipping routes, or implementing security measures that could affect warp travel. The houses use this leverage to ensure that imperial trade policy supports their territorial claims and provides adequate protection for their commercial interests. The role of Navigator houses in imperial exploration policy reflects their unique position as the only reliable means of accessing previously unknown regions of the galaxy. The houses maintain detailed records of successful exploration missions, failed expeditions, and regions that remain too dangerous for conventional navigation attempts. This information proves invaluable for Imperial planners seeking to expand the Imperium's borders or establish contact with isolated human populations. The houses carefully manage access to this intelligence, using it to negotiate favorable terms for their participation in exploration ventures, while ensuring that their most sensitive navigation secrets remain protected. The ancient compacts between Navigator houses and Space Marine chapters represent some of the most enduring and significant agreements in Imperial history, forged during the Great Crusade and maintained through millennia of mutual service and shared sacrifice. These agreements typically grant specific Navigator houses exclusive rights to provide navigation services for particular chapters, creating relationships that extend beyond simple commercial contracts to encompass mutual defense obligations, shared intelligence, and coordinated strategic planning. The exclusivity of these arrangements ensures that both parties can develop specialized procedures and equipment optimized for their particular partnership. House Belisarius maintains one of the most prestigious of these ancient compacts through their exclusive contract with the Ultramarines chapter, a relationship that dates back to the early days of the Great Crusade, when their navigators guided Robute Guilliman's forces during the expansion into the Ultramar sector. This partnership has evolved over millennia to include joint training exercises, shared intelligence operations, and coordinated responses to threats within Ultramar space. The House maintains permanent facilities on several Ultramarines worlds, providing rapid response capabilities for chapter operations, while ensuring that their most experienced navigators remain available for critical missions. The relationship between House Raven and the Imperial Fists reflects the military traditions that both organizations share, with House Navigators serving not merely as ship pilots, but as integral members of Imperial Fists strike forces. This partnership includes provisions for House Raven Navigators to receive combat training alongside chapter serfs, and to participate in defensive operations when Imperial Fists installations come under attack. The House has developed specialized navigation techniques optimized for the Imperial Fists' preference for direct assault tactics, allowing their vessels to execute rapid deployment maneuvers that support the chapter's strategic doctrine. The mutual defense provisions included in these compacts create obligations that extend beyond the immediate needs of either party, establishing networks of alliance that can be activated during major crises or conflicts. When Navigator House territories come under attack, their allied Space Marine chapters are bound to provide military assistance, while the Houses reciprocate by prioritizing chapter transportation needs and providing intelligence about potential threats. These mutual defense arrangements have proven crucial during major conflicts, including the Horus Heresy and subsequent Black Crusades, where the coordination between Navigator Houses and Space Marine chapters provided essential strategic advantages. The exclusive navigation contracts negotiated between Houses and chapters include detailed specifications for service levels, response times, and operational security that reflect the unique requirements of Space Marine operations. These contracts typically guarantee that the chapter will receive priority access to the House's most experienced navigators, specialized vessels equipped for military operations, and dedicated support staff trained in chapter protocols and security procedures. The exclusivity of these arrangements prevents competing houses from accessing sensitive chapter intelligence, while ensuring that the contracted house maintains sufficient resources to meet all chapter requirements. The relationship between Navigator Houses and the Adeptus Mechanicus represents one of the most complex and technically sophisticated partnerships within the Imperial hierarchy, combining the House's specialized knowledge of warp navigation with the Mechanicus's mastery of starship construction and maintenance. This relationship encompasses not only the practical aspects of maintaining warp-capable vessels, but also collaborative research programs aimed at improving navigation equipment, developing new protective technologies, and enhancing the safety and efficiency of warp travel. The maintenance of warp-capable vessels requires intimate cooperation between Navigator House technical staff and Mechanicus tech priests, as the specialized equipment used for warp navigation must be integrated with the ship's broader systems while maintaining the psychic shielding and environmental controls necessary for navigator safety. The Navigator Houses maintain their own technical specialists who understand the specific requirements of their house's navigation equipment, while the Mechanicus provides the broader engineering expertise needed to integrate these systems with ship operations. This collaboration requires careful coordination to ensure that modifications or repairs do not compromise either navigation effectiveness or overall vessel performance. The development of specialized navigation equipment represents a key area of cooperation between Navigator Houses and the Mechanicus, with joint research programs focused on improving the accuracy, safety, and reliability of warp navigation systems. These programs combine Navigator practical experience with Mechanicus technical expertise to create innovations that benefit both organizations. The houses provide detailed feedback about equipment performance under operational conditions, while the Mechanicus contributes engineering solutions that address identified problems or enhance existing capabilities. The Navigator house's relationship with Mechanicus Forge worlds extends beyond simple technical cooperation to encompass political and economic partnerships that influence the development of Imperial starship construction programs. The houses use their influence to ensure that new vessel designs incorporate features that optimize Navigator performance, while the Mechanicus benefits from Navigator expertise in designing ships capable of extended warp operations. These partnerships often include exclusive agreements where specific Forge worlds provide specialized equipment or services to particular Navigator houses in exchange for preferential treatment in navigation contracts. The sharing of technical knowledge between Navigator houses and the Mechanicus operates under carefully negotiated agreements that protect the proprietary interests of both parties while enabling beneficial collaboration. The houses guard their navigation techniques and genetic enhancement procedures as closely held secrets, while the Mechanicus protects their manufacturing processes and technical specifications. The agreements governing knowledge sharing include detailed provisions for intellectual property rights, security protocols, and limitations on the use of shared information to prevent unauthorized disclosure or misuse. The political landscape of Terra itself reflects the significant influence wielded by Navigator houses through their palatial estates, private military forces, and extensive networks of political connections. The Navigator Quarter, located in one of Terra's most prestigious districts, houses the primary residences of the major houses along with their administrative facilities, diplomatic missions, and cultural institutions. These estates serve as centers of political activity where House representatives conduct negotiations, gather intelligence, and coordinate their activities with other imperial institutions. The architectural grandeur of Navigator estates reflects both their ancient heritage and their current wealth and influence. House Belisarius maintains a sprawling complex that includes multiple residential wings, administrative buildings, and specialized facilities for training young navigators. The estate's design incorporates both defensive features and ceremonial spaces, with high walls and defensive towers surrounding courtyards and gardens that provide venues for diplomatic receptions and political gatherings. The buildings themselves display the distinctive architectural style favored by Navigator houses, with elongated proportions and unusual geometric patterns that reflect their occupants' alien nature. The private armies maintained by Navigator houses on Terra serve multiple functions, including estate security, ceremonial duties, and potential military intervention in imperial politics. These forces typically include both conventional military units and specialized troops trained to combat psychic threats and protect against assassination attempts. The House Belisarius Guard represents one of the most professional of these forces, with recruitment standards and training programs that rival those of Imperial Guard regiments. Their distinctive uniforms and equipment reflect their house's ancient traditions while incorporating modern weapons and protective gear that ensure their effectiveness in contemporary conflicts. The influence of Navigator houses over imperial governance operates through both formal and informal channels, with house representatives participating in various imperial institutions while maintaining extensive networks of personal relationships with key officials. The houses use their wealth and political connections to influence policy decisions, secure favorable treatment for their interests, and gather intelligence about potential threats or opportunities. This influence extends beyond matters directly related to navigation, encompassing broader issues of imperial policy that might affect their long-term interests or strategic position. The economic power wielded by Navigator houses provides them with significant leverage in imperial politics, as their control over interstellar transportation makes them essential partners for virtually every aspect of imperial operations. The houses use this economic influence to negotiate favorable terms for their services, while ensuring that imperial policy supports their territorial claims and protects their commercial interests. The most successful houses have developed sophisticated financial operations that extend far beyond navigation services, including investments in manufacturing, agriculture, and resource extraction that provide additional sources of wealth and political influence. The coordination between navigator houses in their political activities requires careful management of competing interests and territorial disputes while presenting a unified front on issues that affect the entire Navis Nobilite. The houses maintain formal mechanisms for coordinating their political activities, including regular conferences where representatives discuss common concerns and develop joint strategies for addressing challenges to their collective interests. These coordination efforts are complicated by the intense competition between houses for lucrative contracts and territorial rights, requiring skilled diplomacy to balance cooperation with competition. The influence of navigator houses extends into the imperial military hierarchy through their relationships with senior officers, strategic planners, and logistics specialists who depend on navigator services for their operations. The houses cultivate these relationships through a combination of superior service, political connections, and mutual benefit arrangements that create networks of influence throughout the imperial military structure. These relationships provide the houses with intelligence about military planning, early warning of potential conflicts, and opportunities to influence strategic decisions that might affect their interests. The role of navigator houses in shaping imperial exploration policy reflects their unique position as the primary means of accessing unknown regions of the galaxy and their extensive knowledge of warp conditions throughout imperial space. The houses maintain detailed records of successful exploration missions, dangerous regions to avoid, and potential opportunities for expansion that provide valuable intelligence for imperial planners. This information is carefully managed and selectively shared to ensure that the houses maintain their advantageous position while supporting imperial expansion objectives. The political maneuvering between navigator houses and other imperial institutions involves complex negotiations over jurisdiction, authority, and resource allocation that reflect the competing interests of different organizations within the imperial hierarchy. The houses must balance their desire for autonomy with the need to maintain cooperative relationships with the Adeptus Mechanicus, Imperial Navy, and other institutions that provide essential services or could potentially threaten their interests. These negotiations require sophisticated understanding of imperial law, politics, and bureaucracy, as well as the ability to identify and exploit opportunities for mutual benefit. The private fleets maintained by navigator houses represent some of the most sophisticated and specialized naval forces within the Imperium, designed specifically to serve the unique operational requirements of the Navis Nobilite while projecting their power and influence across the galaxy. These vessels combine cutting-edge Imperial technology with ancient archaeotech systems, creating ships that possess capabilities far beyond those available to conventional Imperial forces. The distinctive design philosophy employed by navigator shipwrights emphasizes enhanced warp navigation capabilities, superior defensive systems, and specialized equipment that optimizes the performance of navigator crews during extended operations in hostile environments. The hull configurations of navigator vessels reflect their specialized role, featuring elongated profiles that provide optimal placement for navigation chambers while maintaining structural integrity during the extreme stresses of warp transit. The forward sections of these ships house the primary navigation facilities, including the navigator's sanctum, backup navigation chambers, and specialized equipment bays that contain the sophisticated instruments required for precise warp observation and course plotting. These areas are heavily shielded against both physical damage and psychic interference, with multiple layers of protective barriers that ensure navigator safety even during combat operations. The navigation chambers themselves represent masterpieces of both engineering and artistry, designed to provide optimal conditions for warp observation while reflecting the cultural traditions and aesthetic preferences of their respective houses. House Belisarius vessels feature navigation chambers with crystalline observation domes that focus and amplify psychic energy, allowing their navigators to achieve exceptional clarity of warp sight even under adverse conditions. The chambers are surrounded by intricate geometric patterns carved into the bulkheads, creating resonance effects that enhance psychic perception while providing symbolic protection against warp entities. The defensive capabilities of navigator vessels far exceed those of comparable Imperial ships, incorporating multiple redundant systems that provide protection against conventional weapons, psychic attacks, and the various hazards encountered during warp travel. The void shields employed by navigator fleets utilize advanced harmonic frequencies that create particularly effective barriers against energy weapons and psychic manifestations, while specialized armor plating incorporates materials that naturally resist warp influence and provide enhanced protection against boarding actions by chaos entities. The weapon systems mounted on navigator vessels reflect their dual role as exploration ships and military assets, combining long-range sensors with powerful armaments that can engage threats at extreme distances. The lance batteries favored by many navigator houses utilize focused energy beams that can penetrate enemy shields and armor with exceptional precision, while their torpedo systems employ specialized warheads designed to disrupt psychic phenomena and damage warp-capable vessels. The placement of these weapons follows careful design principles that ensure they can be operated effectively even when the ship's primary systems are focused on navigation duties. The propulsion systems of navigator vessels incorporate both conventional plasma drives and specialized warp engines that provide enhanced maneuverability within the Immaterium. These engines feature advanced containment systems that prevent warp energy from contaminating the ship's interior while providing the power output necessary for rapid course changes and emergency maneuvers. The fuel systems for these engines include specialized storage facilities for the exotic materials required for extended warp operations, with automated processing systems that ensure optimal fuel mixture and prevent contamination that could compromise engine performance. The crew quarters aboard navigator vessels reflect the aristocratic traditions of their owners while providing the specialized facilities required for extended deep space operations. The navigator families maintain luxurious residential sections that include private dining areas, recreational facilities, and ceremonial chambers where house traditions can be observed during long voyages. The crew quarters for house retainers and technical staff provide comfortable accommodations that ensure high morale and performance during extended missions, with specialized medical facilities that can address the unique health challenges faced by those who serve aboard navigator vessels. The role of house fleets in protecting navigator interests extends far beyond simple military defense, encompassing intelligence gathering, diplomatic missions, and economic enforcement activities that maintain house influence throughout their territories. These fleets conduct regular patrols through house-controlled systems, monitoring for potential threats while demonstrating the house's continued presence and authority to local populations and potential rivals. The patrol schedules are carefully coordinated to ensure comprehensive coverage of critical trade routes and strategic locations, while maintaining sufficient forces in reserve to respond to unexpected crises. The intelligence gathering capabilities of navigator fleets rely on sophisticated sensor arrays and specialized reconnaissance equipment that can detect and analyze threats across vast distances. These systems include both conventional sensors and psychic detection equipment that can identify the presence of chaos cults, rogue psychers, and other threats that might compromise navigator operations. The intelligence gathered through these operations is analyzed by House specialists who provide regular reports to House leadership and share critical information with allied Imperial institutions when circumstances require coordinated responses. The enforcement of navigator contracts represents one of the most delicate aspects of House fleet operations, requiring careful balance between protecting House interests and maintaining relationships with Imperial institutions and civilian populations. When clients fail to meet their contractual obligations or attempt to circumvent navigator monopolies, House fleets may be deployed to apply economic pressure through trade disruption or blockade operations. These enforcement actions must be conducted within the bounds of Imperial law, while demonstrating the serious consequences of violating agreements with the Navis Nobilite. The diplomatic missions conducted by navigator fleets serve to maintain and expand house influence throughout the galaxy, with specially equipped vessels serving as mobile embassies that can respond rapidly to political developments or opportunities for new partnerships. These diplomatic ships feature enhanced communication systems, luxurious reception facilities, and specialized security equipment that ensures the safety of House representatives during negotiations with potentially hostile parties. The diplomatic protocols followed by these missions reflect centuries of navigator tradition while adapting to the complex political realities of imperial governance. The private exploration missions undertaken by navigator houses beyond imperial borders represent some of the most dangerous and potentially rewarding activities conducted by their fleets. These expeditions venture into uncharted regions of the galaxy, seeking new trade routes, lost human colonies, and archaeotech artifacts that could enhance House capabilities or provide valuable intelligence about threats to imperial security. The ships assigned to these missions receive additional armor, enhanced life support systems, and specialized equipment designed to operate in environments where imperial support is unavailable. The exploration vessels employed for these missions feature extended range capabilities that allow them to operate independently for months or even years without resupply, with enlarged cargo holds that can accommodate the supplies and equipment necessary for extended operations. The crews of these ships include specialists in xenobiology, archaeology, and first contact protocols, ensuring that exploration missions can respond appropriately to whatever discoveries they encounter. The security details aboard exploration vessels include elite troops trained in combat against unknown threats and equipped with weapons and armor optimized for operations in hostile environments. The relationship between navigator houses and the Imperial Navy operates through a complex framework of mutual dependence and carefully negotiated agreements that balance the Navy's need for navigator services with the House's desire to maintain their independence and protect their commercial interests. The provision of navigators for military vessels follows established protocols that ensure adequate coverage for naval operations, while preventing the Navy from gaining excessive influence over navigator activities or accessing sensitive House information. The assignment of navigators to Imperial Navy vessels requires careful consideration of both military requirements and House interests, with senior House officials working closely with naval command staff to ensure optimal deployment of navigator resources. The most experienced and capable navigators are typically assigned to flagship vessels and critical missions, while newer or less experienced House members serve aboard escort vessels and routine patrol ships. This assignment system ensures that the Navy receives the navigation support it requires, while providing valuable training opportunities for developing navigator talents. The coordination protocols established between navigator houses and the Imperial Navy during wartime operations create unified command structures that can respond effectively to military crises while respecting the autonomy of both organizations. These protocols include provisions for emergency reassignment of navigator personnel, priority access to House fleet resources, and coordinated intelligence sharing that enhances the effectiveness of joint operations. The implementation of these protocols requires careful communication between House representatives and naval command staff to ensure that all parties understand their roles and responsibilities. The wartime service obligations of navigator houses include not only the provision of individual navigators, but also the deployment of House fleets in support of major military operations. These deployments can involve House vessels serving as scouts, communication relays, or specialized support ships that provide capabilities unavailable to conventional naval forces. The Houses maintain detailed contingency plans for wartime deployment that ensure they can respond rapidly to military emergencies while protecting their most critical assets and personnel. The ancient void ships possessed by the oldest navigator houses represent some of the most valuable and mysterious assets within the Imperium, with many vessels dating back to the dark age of technology and incorporating technologies that can no longer be reproduced by contemporary imperial forces. These archaeotech vessels feature construction techniques and materials that surpass modern imperial capabilities, with hull designs that demonstrate engineering principles lost to current knowledge. The preservation of these ancient ships requires specialized maintenance procedures and replacement parts that can only be obtained through careful archaeological expeditions or complex negotiations with the Adeptus Mechanicus. House Belisarius maintains one of the most impressive collections of archaeotech vessels, including the ancient flagship, Stellar Majesty, that served as the house's primary command vessel during the Great Crusade. This massive ship features a hull composed of materials that demonstrate remarkable resistance to both physical damage and warp influence, with internal systems that continue to function despite their incredible age. The navigation chambers aboard this vessel incorporate crystalline formations that enhance psychic perception to levels that modern equipment cannot match, making it an invaluable asset for the most challenging navigation missions. The Void Walker, an ancient exploration vessel belonging to House Nostromo, represents another example of Dark Age technology that continues to provide capabilities far beyond those of contemporary ships. This vessel features propulsion systems that can achieve warp speeds previously thought impossible, with energy containment systems that prevent the dangerous side effects typically associated with such extreme performance. The ship's sensor arrays can detect and analyze phenomena across vast distances, providing intelligence-gathering capabilities that make it invaluable for exploration missions in the most dangerous regions of the galaxy. The maintenance requirements for these ancient vessels present ongoing challenges for their Navigator house owners, as the specialized knowledge required to service Dark Age technology is extremely rare and difficult to obtain. The houses maintain dedicated teams of technical specialists who study these ancient systems and develop maintenance procedures that can preserve their functionality without compromising their unique capabilities. These maintenance operations often require materials and components that can only be obtained through archaeological expeditions or complex negotiations with Mechanicus Forge worlds that possess relevant expertise. The strategic value of archaeotech vessels extends beyond their immediate capabilities to encompass their role as repositories of ancient knowledge and technology that could potentially be reverse engineered to enhance modern imperial capabilities. The houses guard these vessels jealously, recognizing that their loss would represent not only a significant reduction in house capabilities, but also the permanent loss of irreplaceable technological heritage. The security measures protecting these ships include both conventional defenses and specialized systems designed to prevent unauthorized access to their most sensitive systems and information. The operational deployment of archaeotech vessels requires careful consideration of both their capabilities and their irreplaceable nature, with house leadership reserving these assets for only the most critical missions where their unique abilities provide decisive advantages. The crews selected to operate these vessels undergo extensive training and background checks to ensure their reliability and competence, while specialized protocols govern their use to minimize the risk of damage or loss. The successful operation of these ancient ships often determines the outcome of crucial house operations and provides significant advantages in competition with rival houses. The integration of archaeotech systems with modern imperial technology presents ongoing technical challenges that require innovative solutions and careful engineering to ensure compatibility and optimal performance. The houses work closely with selected Mechanicus specialists to develop interface systems that allow ancient and modern technologies to work together effectively, while maintaining the security and proprietary nature of their most sensitive systems. These integration efforts often result in hybrid systems that combine the best aspects of both ancient and modern technology, creating capabilities that exceed what either could achieve independently. The research programs conducted by Navigator houses to understand and preserve their archaeotech assets represent significant investments in both resources and specialized personnel, with dedicated facilities and equipment designed to analyze ancient systems without damaging them. These research efforts focus on understanding the principles underlying Dark Age technology, while developing techniques for maintaining and potentially replicating these systems, using contemporary materials and methods. The knowledge gained through these programs is carefully guarded and shared only with trusted allies and essential personnel who require access to perform their duties effectively. The existence of every navigator represents a constant battle against forces that seek their destruction, corruption, or exploitation, with threats emanating from the very source of their power as well as from the societies they serve. The warp itself poses the most fundamental and inescapable danger, as prolonged exposure to the Immaterium's chaotic energies gradually erodes the navigator's sanity, physical form, and spiritual integrity. Each time a navigator opens their pineal eye to observe the warp's currents, they risk exposure to entities that exist beyond human comprehension, beings of pure malevolence that view the navigator's psychic light as both a beacon to follow and a prize to claim. The progressive madness that afflicts all navigators manifests in subtle ways during their early careers, beginning with minor personality changes and occasional lapses in judgment that can be dismissed as stress or fatigue. The navigator might experience brief moments of confusion about their location or identity, sudden mood swings that seem disconnected from their circumstances, or disturbing dreams that blend warp imagery with personal memories. These early symptoms often go unnoticed by colleagues and family members, as navigators learn to hide their growing instability behind facades of professional competence and aristocratic composure. The deterioration accelerates with each warp transit, as the navigator's mind struggles to process experiences that violate the fundamental laws of physics and logic. Time becomes fluid during extended warp observation, with past, present, and future events blending together in ways that make coherent thought increasingly difficult. The navigator might find themselves responding to conversations that occurred years ago, preparing for events that have already concluded, or experiencing intense emotional reactions to situations that exist only in potential futures they have glimpsed through their enhanced perception. The physical mutations that accompany warp exposure create visible evidence of the navigator's deteriorating condition, with their already alien appearance becoming increasingly grotesque as their career progresses. The skin develops a translucent quality that reveals the network of blood vessels beneath, while the bones become brittle and prone to spontaneous fractures. The navigator's hair often falls out entirely or changes to unnatural colors that shift depending on their emotional state, while their fingernails grow at accelerated rates and develop sharp, claw-like points that must be regularly trimmed to prevent injury. The most disturbing mutations affect the navigator's sensory organs, with their conventional eyes gradually developing the same otherworldly appearance as their pineal eye. The irises might change color without warning, displaying hues that have no equivalent in normal human vision, while the pupils dilate or contract independently of lighting conditions. Some navigators develop additional sensory organs, including vestigial eyes that appear at random locations on their body or sensitive patches of skin that can detect psychic emanations from nearby individuals. The threat of demonic possession represents the most immediate and deadly danger faced by navigators during their warp observations, as the entities that inhabit the Immaterium are constantly seeking opportunities to enter real space through psychically active individuals. The navigator's enhanced perception makes them particularly attractive targets for possession, as their mental discipline and specialized training provide demons with the possibility of accessing a host who can function effectively in the material universe while maintaining their psychic abilities. The signs of impending demonic attention often manifest as subtle changes in the navigator's warp perception, with familiar currents displaying unusual colors or patterns that suggest external influence. The navigator might notice that certain regions of warp space seem to watch them during observation, with shadows or movements that appear to respond to their presence, rather than following the natural flow of psychic energy. These manifestations typically begin as barely perceptible anomalies that can be dismissed as imagination or fatigue, but gradually intensify until they become undeniable evidence of demonic interest. The process of demonic possession rarely occurs as a sudden overwhelming assault, instead developing through a gradual corruption that begins with whispered suggestions and false visions designed to undermine the navigator's mental defenses. The demon might present itself as a helpful guide offering superior navigation techniques, a concerned ancestor providing warnings about future dangers, or a benevolent entity seeking to enhance the navigator's abilities through supernatural gifts. These deceptions exploit the navigator's isolation and the psychological pressures of their profession, offering solutions to problems that seem increasingly insurmountable through conventional means. The detection of demonic influence requires constant vigilance from both the navigator and their support staff, as the subtle nature of early corruption makes it difficult to distinguish from the normal psychological effects of warp exposure. House medical personnel receive specialized training in recognizing the signs of demonic contamination, including changes in speech patterns, unusual knowledge of events the navigator could not have witnessed, and behavioral modifications that suggest external influence on their decision-making processes. The Imperial population's fear and suspicion of navigators creates a constant source of tension that affects every aspect of their interaction with normal humanity, despite their protected status within the Imperial hierarchy. The average Imperial citizen views navigators with a mixture of awe and revulsion, recognizing their essential role in maintaining interstellar civilization while being deeply disturbed by their obvious mutations and psychic abilities. This ambivalence manifests in various forms of discrimination and hostility that range from subtle social exclusion to outright violence against navigator personnel and their families. The religious persecution faced by navigators stems from the widespread belief that their mutations represent a form of spiritual contamination that marks them as inherently untrustworthy and potentially dangerous. Many Imperial citizens view the navigator's third eye as a mark of corruption, associating it with the malevolent entities that inhabit the warp rather than recognizing it as a specialized organ that serves essential Imperial functions. This religious prejudice is often encouraged by local clergy who lack understanding of the navigator's true nature and role, leading to sermons that characterize them as necessary evils rather than valued servants of the Emperor. The social isolation experienced by navigators in Imperial society extends beyond religious prejudice to encompass practical concerns about their alien appearance and unpredictable behavior. Normal humans find prolonged interaction with navigators deeply unsettling, as their otherworldly appearance and occasional lapses into warp-induced confusion create an atmosphere of unease that makes casual social relationships difficult to maintain. This isolation is particularly pronounced for younger navigators who have not yet learned to control their mutations or develop the aristocratic bearing that helps their elders command respect through authority rather than affection. The economic discrimination faced by navigator houses in their dealings with Imperial institutions reflects the underlying tension between their essential services and the discomfort their presence creates among normal humans. Merchants and administrators often attempt to minimize their direct contact with navigator personnel, preferring to conduct business through intermediaries or automated systems that reduce the need for face-to-face interaction. This preference for indirect communication can complicate negotiations and create delays that affect the efficiency of navigator operations. The legal challenges faced by navigators when their protected status conflicts with local laws or customs create complex situations that require careful navigation of Imperial bureaucracy and political pressure. Local authorities might attempt to impose restrictions on navigator activities that exceed their legal authority, while religious leaders may advocate for policies that would limit navigator access to public facilities or social institutions. These conflicts often require intervention by higher Imperial authorities to resolve, creating political tensions that can affect the navigator house's relationships with other Imperial institutions. The chaos forces that specifically target navigators represent one of the most organized and persistent threats to the Navis Nobilite. as the destruction or corruption of Navigator capabilities would cripple the Imperium's ability to maintain interstellar communication and transportation. Chaos cults operating within Imperial territory often include specialized cells dedicated to identifying and eliminating Navigator personnel, using a combination of conventional assassination techniques and psychic attacks designed to exploit the Navigator's enhanced sensitivity to warp phenomena. The infiltration tactics employed by Chaos agents against Navigator houses involve long-term operations that can span decades or even centuries, with cultists establishing themselves in positions of trust within house organizations before revealing their true allegiances. These infiltrators might pose as loyal retainers, technical specialists, or even marriage partners, using their access to gather intelligence about house operations while seeking opportunities to sabotage critical systems or assassinate key personnel. The detection of such infiltration requires constant vigilance and sophisticated security procedures that can strain house resources and create an atmosphere of paranoia that affects all aspects of house operations. The corruption campaigns directed against Navigator houses by Chaos forces often focus on exploiting the genetic instabilities and psychological pressures that affect all Navigator bloodlines, offering false solutions to hereditary problems or enhanced abilities that come at the cost of spiritual corruption. Chaos agents might present themselves as genetic researchers, offering revolutionary treatments for Navigator mutations, psychic tutors claiming to teach advanced navigation techniques, or merchants providing access to rare materials and technologies that could enhance house capabilities. The psychic attacks launched against Navigator installations represent particularly dangerous forms of Chaos aggression, as they exploit the Navigator's enhanced sensitivity to warp phenomena while targeting the very abilities that make them valuable to the Imperium. These attacks might involve the projection of false visions designed to mislead navigators during critical navigation decisions, the implantation of subliminal suggestions that influence their behavior over extended periods, or direct assaults on their psychic defenses that can cause permanent damage to their abilities. The strategic objectives pursued by Chaos forces in their campaigns against Navigator houses extend beyond simple destruction to encompass the corruption of Navigator capabilities for their own purposes. A Navigator who has been successfully corrupted by Chaos can serve as a powerful asset for enemy forces, providing navigation services for Chaos fleets while using their legitimate position to gather intelligence about Imperial military movements and strategic planning. The conversion of even a single Navigator to Chaos service can compromise entire house operations and provide enemy forces with detailed knowledge of Imperial navigation routes and defensive positions. The internal threats that emerge from within Navigator houses themselves often prove more dangerous than external enemies, as they exploit the intimate knowledge of house operations and security procedures that only insiders possess. The intense competition between different branches of Navigator families can escalate into assassination attempts, sabotage operations, and political conspiracies that threaten the stability of entire houses. These internal conflicts are often driven by disputes over succession rights, territorial claims, or marriage arrangements that affect the distribution of power and resources within the house hierarchy. The genetic sabotage operations conducted by rival Navigator bloodlines represent one of the most insidious forms of internal threat, as they target the very foundation of Navigator power and influence. These operations might involve the introduction of genetic toxins into food or water supplies, the corruption of genetic enhancement treatments, or the deliberate breeding of defective offspring designed to weaken rival bloodlines. The detection of such sabotage requires sophisticated genetic monitoring systems and medical expertise that can identify artificial modifications or contamination before they cause permanent damage. The assassination attempts directed against Navigator leadership often involve complex plots that combine conventional weapons with psychic attacks designed to exploit the target's enhanced sensitivity to warp phenomena. The assassins might use specialized ammunition that contains psychically active materials, deploy weapons that generate disruptive psychic fields, or employ psychers trained to target the specific neural pathways that enable navigator abilities. The protection of navigator leadership requires security measures that address both conventional and psychic threats, creating defensive systems that can be extremely expensive and difficult to maintain. The political conspiracies that develop within navigator houses often involve elaborate schemes to manipulate succession procedures, marriage arrangements, or territorial assignments in ways that benefit specific bloodlines at the expense of their rivals. These conspiracies might include the falsification of genetic records, the bribery of house officials, or the formation of secret alliances between different branches of the family that seek to overthrow the existing leadership structure. The detection and prevention of such conspiracies requires intelligence networks and security procedures that can monitor internal communications and identify potential threats before they can be implemented. The economic warfare conducted between rival navigator houses involves sophisticated campaigns designed to undermine competitors' financial stability and commercial relationships while enhancing their own market position. These campaigns might include the deliberate undercutting of contract prices, the spread of false information about rival house capabilities, or the sabotage of competitors' operations through the corruption of their personnel or the disruption of their supply chains. The most successful economic warfare campaigns combine multiple tactics over extended periods, gradually weakening rival houses until they become vulnerable to more direct forms of attack. The territorial disputes that arise between navigator houses over control of lucrative trade routes or strategic locations often escalate into armed conflicts that can involve entire house fleets and private military forces. These conflicts typically begin with legal challenges and diplomatic negotiations, but can quickly escalate to include economic sanctions, naval blockades, and direct military confrontation. The resolution of such disputes requires careful balance between protecting house interests and maintaining the stability of the broader navigator community, as excessive conflict can weaken all houses and create opportunities for external enemies to exploit. The succession crises that periodically affect navigator houses create periods of vulnerability when internal conflicts can escalate into open warfare between different claimants to leadership positions. These crises often involve complex legal disputes over inheritance rights, genetic qualifications, and political legitimacy that can take years or even decades to resolve. During these periods, house operations may be disrupted, security measures may be compromised, and rival factions may seek external support that can introduce foreign influences into house affairs. The management of these various threats requires navigator houses to maintain sophisticated intelligence networks, security organizations, and defensive capabilities that can address multiple types of danger simultaneously. The most successful houses develop comprehensive threat assessment procedures that can identify potential problems before they become serious dangers, while maintaining the flexibility to respond effectively to unexpected challenges. The cost of these defensive measures represents a significant portion of house resources, but the consequences of inadequate protection can include the complete destruction of bloodlines that have served the Imperium for millennia. The psychological toll of constant vigilance against multiple threats affects all members of navigator houses, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion that can interfere with normal family relationships and house operations. The need to constantly evaluate potential threats and maintain defensive postures can exhaust house resources and personnel, while the stress of living under constant danger can exacerbate the mental health problems that already affect navigator populations due to their warp exposure. The most successful houses develop support systems and coping mechanisms that help their members manage these psychological pressures while maintaining their operational effectiveness. The elaborate court ceremonies that define navigator society represent a complex fusion of ancient Terran aristocratic traditions and mystical practices developed specifically to honor their unique relationship with the warp. These ceremonies serve multiple functions within navigator houses, establishing hierarchical relationships between different bloodlines while reinforcing the spiritual significance of their genetic heritage and their role as humanity's guides through the Immaterium. The most significant of these ceremonies is the ritual of stellar ascendance, performed when a navigator achieves senior rank within their house hierarchy and gains the authority to command lesser family members during navigation operations. The ritual of stellar ascendance takes place within specially constructed ceremonial chambers that feature astronomical alignments and psychic resonance patterns designed to enhance the spiritual significance of the proceedings. The chamber walls display intricate star charts that map the major warp routes controlled by the house, while the ceiling incorporates crystalline formations that focus ambient psychic energy and create subtle lighting effects that shift in response to the emotional state of the participants. The floor features geometric patterns carved from rare stones that naturally resist warp influence, creating a sacred space where the ceremony can proceed without interference from malevolent entities. The ceremony begins with the purification of the candidate, who must undergo a period of fasting and meditation designed to cleanse their mind of worldly concerns and prepare them for the spiritual transformation that accompanies their elevation in rank. During this preparation period, the candidate receives instruction in the advanced navigation techniques and house secrets that will become their responsibility once the ceremony is complete. The purification process includes the application of sacred oils derived from plants that grow only in the Navigator quarter of Terra, substances that enhance psychic sensitivity while providing protection against warp contamination. The actual ceremony involves the participation of all senior house members, who form a circle around the candidate while reciting ancient invocations that trace the history of their bloodline back to the first navigator ancestors who served during the Age of Strife. These invocations include detailed genealogical recitations that establish the candidate's genetic heritage and their right to assume greater responsibility within the house structure. The ceremony incorporates elements of both imperial religious tradition and pre-imperial practices that predate the Emperor's unification of Terra, creating a unique spiritual framework that reflects the Navigators' position as intermediaries between human civilization and the chaotic forces of the warp. The climax of the ceremony occurs when the candidate opens their pineal eye in the presence of the assembled house members, demonstrating their ability to perceive warp currents while maintaining their sanity and spiritual integrity. This demonstration serves as both a test of the candidate's capabilities and a symbolic representation of their commitment to using their abilities in service of their house and the broader Imperium. The assembled house members observe the candidate's warp sight through specialized viewing devices that allow them to witness the ceremony without exposing themselves to the dangerous energies involved. The ancient rituals practiced by navigator houses include seasonal observances that correspond to significant astronomical events and celebrate the cyclical nature of their relationship with the warp. The Festival of the Void's Eye, celebrated during the Terran winter solstice, commemorates the first successful warp transit accomplished by their ancestors during the Age of Strife. This festival involves elaborate feasts where house members consume foods prepared according to ancient recipes that incorporate ingredients believed to enhance psychic sensitivity and provide protection against warp contamination. The Festival of the Void's Eye includes ceremonial hunts conducted within the Navigator Quarter, where house members pursue specially bred creatures that possess limited psychic abilities and can serve as practice targets for developing navigator skills. These hunts follow strict protocols that ensure the safety of all participants while providing opportunities for younger house members to demonstrate their growing abilities under controlled conditions. The creatures used in these hunts are carefully selected for their psychic signature and behavioral patterns, creating challenging but manageable targets that can help navigators develop their warp sight accuracy and reaction speed. The maintenance of pre-imperial traditions within navigator society reflects their unique position as one of the few human populations that maintained continuous cultural development throughout the Age of Strife and subsequent imperial expansion. These traditions include linguistic practices that preserve ancient Terran dialects, artistic styles that predate imperial cultural standardization, and social customs that reflect the aristocratic societies that existed before the emperor's unification campaigns. The preservation of these traditions serves both practical and symbolic functions, maintaining cultural identity while providing continuity with their ancestral heritage. The linguistic traditions maintained by navigator houses include the use of high Gothic variations that incorporate technical terminology specific to warp navigation and psychic phenomena. These specialized vocabularies allow navigators to communicate complex concepts related to their profession with precision and nuance that would be impossible using standard Imperial Gothic. The preservation of these linguistic traditions requires dedicated instruction for each new generation of house members, with specialized tutors who understand both the technical and cultural significance of the terminology involved. The artistic traditions of navigator houses emphasize geometric patterns and symbolic representations that reflect their unique perception of space and time through their warp sight abilities. Navigator artists create works that incorporate mathematical principles derived from their observation of warp currents, producing paintings, sculptures, and architectural elements that display non-Euclidean geometries and impossible spatial relationships. These artistic works serve both decorative and functional purposes, creating environments that enhance psychic perception while providing visual representations of concepts that cannot be adequately described through conventional means. The education and training of young navigators begins during early childhood with careful monitoring of their genetic development and psychic potential, as the identification of navigator abilities must occur before the dangerous process of pineal eye awakening can be safely managed. The initial assessment involves detailed genetic analysis that compares the child's DNA patterns with established house bloodline markers, identifying the specific mutations that indicate navigator potential while screening for genetic instabilities that might compromise their development. This analysis requires sophisticated equipment and expertise that only the most established houses can maintain, creating advantages for wealthy families while limiting opportunities for less affluent bloodlines. The childhood indoctrination process includes intensive education in house history, navigation theory, and the cultural traditions that define navigator society. Young potential navigators receive instruction in mathematics, astronomy, and physics that provides the theoretical foundation for understanding warp phenomena, while also learning the practical skills necessary for operating the complex equipment used in navigation chambers. The educational curriculum includes extensive study of house genealogy and the political relationships that define their position within the broader imperial hierarchy. The psychological preparation for navigator training involves conditioning exercises designed to strengthen the child's mental defenses against the chaotic influences they will encounter during warp observation. These exercises include meditation techniques that enhance concentration and emotional control, visualization practices that prepare the mind for perceiving non-Euclidean geometries, and stress resistance training that builds tolerance for the disorienting effects of warp exposure. The psychological preparation process must be carefully calibrated to each individual child's temperament and genetic heritage, as excessive conditioning can damage their psychic potential, while insufficient preparation can result in madness or death during the pineal eye awakening process. The dangerous process of pineal eye awakening typically occurs during adolescence when the navigator's psychic abilities reach sufficient strength to support the formation of their third eye. This process cannot be artificially induced or accelerated without risking permanent damage to the navigator's abilities, requiring careful monitoring of the adolescent's psychic development until the natural awakening process begins. The initial signs of pineal eye formation include severe headaches, visual disturbances, and increased sensitivity to psychic phenomena that indicate the migration of specialized neural tissue toward the forehead region. The medical supervision required during pineal eye awakening involves teams of specialists who understand both the physiological and psychic aspects of navigator development. These medical teams include geneticists who monitor the cellular changes occurring during the awakening process, psychic specialists who can assess the developing navigator's mental state and provide protection against warp contamination, and surgeons who can intervene if complications arise during the formation of the third eye. The medical facilities used for this process feature specialized equipment that can monitor psychic activity while providing the sterile environment necessary for any surgical intervention that might be required. The awakening process itself can last for several weeks or even months, during which the developing navigator experiences progressive changes in their perception and consciousness that can be extremely disorienting and frightening. The formation of the pineal eye involves the growth of entirely new neural pathways that connect the third eye to the navigator's existing sensory and cognitive systems, creating new forms of perception that must be integrated with their existing understanding of reality. The psychological impact of this transformation can be severe, with many young navigators experiencing temporary periods of confusion, depression, or anxiety as they adapt to their enhanced abilities. The survival rate for pineal eye awakening varies significantly between different navigator bloodlines, with the most genetically stable houses achieving success rates of approximately 70%, while less stable bloodlines may experience failure rates that exceed 50%. The factors that influence survival include the genetic purity of the navigator's bloodline, the quality of medical supervision available during the awakening process, and the psychological preparation the candidate received during their childhood training. The houses maintain detailed records of awakening success rates that influence their breeding programs and resource allocation decisions. The role of Navigator Primaris within individual houses encompasses responsibilities that extend far beyond simple navigation duties to include fleet command, political leadership, and the preservation of house secrets and traditions. The Navigator Primaris serves as the senior operational authority within their house, coordinating the activities of lesser navigators while maintaining relationships with external imperial institutions and rival houses. This position requires exceptional abilities in both navigation and leadership, as the Navigator Primaris must balance the technical demands of their profession with the political and administrative responsibilities of house management. The selection process for Navigator Primaris positions involves careful evaluation of candidates' genetic heritage, professional capabilities, and political acumen. The most qualified candidates typically possess the purest bloodlines within their house, demonstrated excellence in navigation operations, and the leadership skills necessary to command respect from other house members. The selection process includes formal testing of navigation abilities, assessment of political judgment through simulated crisis scenarios, and evaluation of the candidate's knowledge of house traditions and secrets. The fleet command responsibilities of Navigator Primaris include strategic planning for house naval operations, coordination with Imperial Navy commands, and the deployment of house resources in support of military campaigns. The Navigator Primaris must understand both the technical capabilities of their house's vessels and the broader strategic considerations that influence imperial military planning. This dual expertise allows them to make informed decisions about resource allocation while ensuring that house interests remain protected during military operations. The political leadership functions of Navigator Primaris involve representing their house in negotiations with other imperial institutions, managing relationships with rival houses, and coordinating the house's response to political developments that might affect their interests. The Navigator Primaris must maintain extensive networks of contacts throughout the imperial hierarchy while carefully managing the flow of information to prevent sensitive house secrets from being compromised. This political role requires sophisticated understanding of imperial bureaucracy and the ability to identify opportunities for advancing house interests through diplomatic means. The guardianship of house secrets and traditions represents one of the most crucial responsibilities of Navigator Primaris, as they serve as the primary custodians of the specialized knowledge that enables their house's navigation capabilities. This knowledge includes technical information about navigation procedures, genetic data about bloodline characteristics, and historical records that document the house's achievements and failures over millennia of service. The Navigator Primaris must ensure that this information remains secure while being transmitted to appropriate successors who can continue the house's operations. The complex marriage customs practiced by Navigator houses reflect their need to balance genetic purity with the practical requirements of avoiding excessive inbreeding that could compromise their psychic abilities. The marriage negotiations between houses involve extensive analysis of genetic compatibility, territorial implications, and political considerations that can take years to resolve. These negotiations require specialized expertise in navigator genetics, imperial law, and political strategy, with dedicated marriage brokers who understand the complex factors that influence successful navigator breeding programs. The genetic purity requirements for navigator marriages include detailed analysis of both partners' bloodline heritage, screening for genetic instabilities that might affect their offspring, and assessment of their psychic compatibility. The genetic analysis involves sophisticated testing procedures that can identify potential problems before they manifest in offspring, while the psychic compatibility assessment determines whether the partner's abilities complement each other in ways that might enhance their children's navigator potential. These requirements create significant constraints on marriage choices while ensuring that navigator bloodlines maintain their essential characteristics. The breeding programs designed to maintain genetic purity while avoiding excessive inbreeding represent one of the most sophisticated genetic management systems in the Imperium. These programs use complex algorithms that analyze the genetic heritage of potential marriage partners across multiple generations, identifying combinations that optimize the likelihood of producing viable navigator offspring while minimizing the risk of genetic defects. The breeding programs require extensive databases that track the genetic characteristics of all house members and their relatives, creating comprehensive genealogical records that span centuries of family history. The management of genetic diversity within navigator bloodlines involves careful coordination between different houses to ensure that marriage exchanges provide sufficient genetic variation to prevent the accumulation of harmful mutations. The houses maintain formal agreements that govern the exchange of marriage partners, including provisions for genetic testing, territorial rights, and the upbringing of offspring. These agreements create complex webs of obligation and alliance that influence house politics and strategic planning for generations. The monitoring systems used to track genetic stability include regular health assessments of all house members, genetic analysis of newborns to identify potential problems, and long-term studies that track the effects of different breeding strategies on navigator abilities. The data collected through these monitoring systems influences all aspects of house breeding programs, from the selection of marriage partners to the allocation of resources for genetic enhancement research. The most successful houses maintain sophisticated genetic laboratories that can perform detailed analysis while developing new techniques for improving navigator genetic stability. The cultural practices surrounding navigator marriages include elaborate ceremonies that celebrate the union while emphasizing its significance for the continuation of house bloodlines. These ceremonies incorporate elements of both imperial religious tradition and ancient navigator customs, creating unique rituals that reflect the special nature of navigator society. The marriage ceremonies include exchanges of genetic records, territorial agreements, and promises of mutual support that bind the participating houses together in complex relationships that extend far beyond the immediate marriage partners. The preservation of navigator genetic heritage through specialized breeding programs requires constant vigilance against the forces of entropy and mutation that threaten to degrade their essential abilities over successive generations. The most successful houses maintain detailed genetic archives that span millennia, documenting the inheritance patterns of specific abilities while tracking the emergence of beneficial mutations that might enhance their bloodline's capabilities. These archives include not only genealogical records, but also detailed medical histories, psychological profiles, and performance evaluations that provide comprehensive data about each family member's contribution to the house's genetic legacy. The catastrophic impact of the Great Rift fundamentally altered the nature of warp travel throughout the galaxy, creating unprecedented challenges for navigator houses that had spent millennia perfecting their techniques for reading the Immaterium's currents. The massive warp storm that split the galaxy into two distinct regions created navigation hazards that exceeded anything previously encountered, with entire sectors becoming inaccessible to conventional warp travel, while previously stable routes transformed into deadly mazes of chaotic energy. The division of Imperial space into Imperium Nihilus and Imperium Sanctus created logistical nightmares that forced navigator houses to completely restructure their operations and develop new strategies for maintaining interstellar communication and transportation. The formation of the Cicatrix Maledictum generated warp phenomena that defied traditional navigation techniques, with the massive storm system creating interference patterns that disrupted the Astronomican signal across vast regions of space. Navigators attempting to guide vessels near the Great Rift reported experiencing visions of impossible geometries, temporal paradoxes, and encounters with entities that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of the warp. The storm's influence extended far beyond its visible boundaries, creating ripple effects that altered warp currents throughout the galaxy and forced navigators to abandon routes that had been considered safe for thousands of years. The challenges posed by navigation in Imperium Nihilus proved particularly severe, as the region's isolation from Terra meant that the Astronomican's guiding light became increasingly difficult to perceive across the vast distances involved. Navigator houses operating in the dark half of the galaxy found themselves forced to rely on alternative navigation methods, including the use of secondary psychic beacons, dead reckoning techniques, and hazardous short-range jumps that increased travel times while dramatically raising the risk of catastrophic navigation errors. The psychological toll on navigators working in these conditions proved enormous, with many experiencing severe mental deterioration after extended periods of operating without the Emperor's guiding light. The development of new navigation techniques, specifically designed to address the challenges of post-Rift warp travel, required unprecedented cooperation between navigator houses that had previously guarded their secrets jealously. The sharing of technical knowledge and operational experience became essential for survival, as individual houses lacked the resources to independently develop solutions to the complex problems created by the galaxy's division. The most innovative houses began experimenting with networked navigation systems that allowed multiple navigators to coordinate their efforts during particularly dangerous transits, combining their perceptions to achieve greater accuracy and safety than any individual could accomplish alone. The role of navigator houses during the 13th Black Crusade demonstrated their crucial importance to Imperial defense efforts, as the massive Chaos Offensive required coordination of naval forces across multiple sectors while maintaining supply lines through increasingly dangerous warp conditions. House Belisarius played a particularly significant role in the defense of Cadia, providing navigation services for the Imperial Navy fleets that attempted to break through the Chaos blockade surrounding the fortress world. Their navigators guided relief convoys through warp routes that had been corrupted by Chaos influence, using their enhanced perception to identify safe passages while avoiding the demon-infested regions that surrounded the main combat zones. The evacuation efforts following Cadia's destruction required navigator houses to coordinate the largest refugee transportation operation in Imperial history, guiding thousands of vessels carrying displaced populations to safety while operating under constant threat of Chaos interdiction. The houses deployed their most experienced navigators to lead these evacuation convoys, accepting enormous risks to ensure that imperial forces and civilian populations could escape the expanding zone of chaos control. Many navigator vessels were lost during these operations, with entire bloodlines sacrificing themselves to ensure the survival of imperial refugees and military personnel. The subsequent Indomitus Crusade presented navigator houses with both opportunities and challenges, as the massive military campaign required navigation services on a scale not seen since the Great Crusade, while operating through warp conditions that had been fundamentally altered by the Great Rift. The houses found themselves stretched to their limits, providing navigation support for the Primaris Space Marine deployments, Adeptus Mechanicus expedition fleets, and Imperial Guard reinforcement convoys that formed the backbone of Robute Guilliman's reconquest efforts. The operational tempo of the Crusade left little time for the rest periods that navigators normally required between major operations, forcing houses to rotate their personnel more frequently while accepting higher casualty rates. The emergence of new warp phenomena following the Great Rift's formation created unprecedented challenges for navigator training programs, as traditional techniques proved inadequate for dealing with the altered conditions throughout Imperial space. The warp storms that proliferated across the galaxy displayed characteristics that differed significantly from historical patterns, with some storms exhibiting temporal effects that could trap vessels in endless loops, while others contained entities that seemed specifically designed to target navigator abilities. The houses were forced to develop new training protocols that prepared their members for these novel threats, while maintaining the traditional skills that remained essential for conventional navigation operations. The adaptation of navigator techniques to address these new challenges required extensive research into the fundamental nature of warp phenomena, with houses investing significant resources in understanding how the Great Rift had altered the Immaterium's basic properties. The most successful adaptation efforts involved the development of enhanced protective rituals that could shield navigators from the specific types of psychic contamination associated with the new warp phenomena, while also creating new observation techniques that could penetrate the interference patterns generated by the expanding storm systems. The innovation in navigator technology accelerated dramatically during this period, as houses collaborated with the Adeptus Mechanicus to develop new equipment that could function effectively in the altered warp conditions. These technological developments included enhanced psychic shielding systems that could protect navigators from the more dangerous forms of warp contamination, improved sensor arrays that could detect the subtle warning signs of approaching warp storms, and communication systems that could maintain contact with other vessels, even when conventional astropathic communication was disrupted by local interference. The political upheaval within the Navis Nobilite following the Great Rift's formation reflected the broader changes occurring throughout imperial society, as traditional power structures and established relationships were challenged by the new realities of a divided galaxy. The return of Robute Guilliman as the Lord Commander of the Imperium created particular tensions for navigator houses, as the Primarch's administrative reforms and military reorganization efforts affected their traditional autonomy and privileged position within the imperial hierarchy. The houses found themselves forced to adapt to new bureaucratic structures while defending their historical rights and privileges against officials who questioned their continued relevance in the changed galactic environment. The relationship between navigator houses and the returned Primarch proved complex and sometimes contentious, as Guilliman's practical approach to imperial administration conflicted with the house's traditional emphasis on ancient privileges and hereditary rights. The Primarch's focus on efficiency and results-oriented governance challenged the house's customary practices, particularly their tendency to prioritize genetic purity and traditional methods over innovative solutions to contemporary problems. The houses were forced to demonstrate their continued value to the Imperium while adapting to new oversight mechanisms and performance standards that differed significantly from their historical arrangements. The administrative reforms implemented by Guilliman's government affected navigator operations in numerous ways, from new reporting requirements that demanded detailed documentation of their activities to standardized procedures that conflicted with traditional house practices. The houses found themselves subject to increased scrutiny from imperial auditors and efficiency experts who lacked understanding of the specialized requirements of navigator operations. The resulting tensions created political challenges that required careful navigation of the new bureaucratic structures while maintaining the operational flexibility essential for effective warp travel. The changing military requirements of the post-Rift Imperium created new opportunities for navigator houses to demonstrate their value, as the increased emphasis on rapid deployment and strategic mobility made their services more crucial than ever. The houses that successfully adapted to these new requirements found themselves with expanded influence and resources, while those that failed to demonstrate their relevance faced potential marginalization within the imperial hierarchy. The competition between houses intensified as they sought to secure the most lucrative military contracts, while positioning themselves as indispensable partners for the Imperium's ongoing military campaigns. The territorial adjustments required by the galaxy's division forced navigator houses to completely restructure their operations, as traditional trade routes and territorial boundaries became meaningless in the face of the Great Rift's barrier effects. Houses that had previously operated primarily in what became Imperium Nihilus found themselves cut off from their traditional power bases and forced to establish new operations in Imperium Sanctus, while those with holdings on both sides of the divide faced the challenge of maintaining coordination across an increasingly impassable barrier. The resource allocation decisions made by navigator houses during this period reflected their need to balance immediate survival requirements with long-term strategic planning, as the uncertainty created by the Great Rift made traditional investment strategies obsolete. The houses were forced to make difficult choices about which territories to defend, which bloodlines to prioritize for genetic preservation, and which technological developments to pursue with their limited resources. These decisions often required painful sacrifices, as houses abandoned ancestral holdings or discontinued traditional practices that had defined their identity for millennia. The emergence of new threats in the post-Rift galaxy required navigator houses to develop enhanced security measures and defensive capabilities, as the proliferation of warp storms and chaos incursions created unprecedented dangers for their operations. The houses invested heavily in military upgrades for their fleets, enhanced protective systems for their facilities, and improved training programs for their security personnel. The most successful houses developed integrated defense strategies that combined conventional military capabilities with specialized anti-psychic measures designed to counter the specific threats posed by the new warp phenomena. The coordination between navigator houses and other imperial institutions became increasingly important as the challenges of the post-Rift galaxy exceeded what any single organization could address independently. The houses found themselves working more closely with the Adeptus Mechanicus on technological solutions, with the Imperial Navy on strategic planning, and with the Adeptus Astra Telepathica on communication protocols. These collaborative efforts required the houses to share information and resources in ways that challenged their traditional secrecy, while creating new opportunities for mutual benefit. The long-term implications of the Great Rift's formation continued to unfold as navigator houses adapted to the new galactic environment, with some changes proving temporary, while others appeared to represent permanent alterations to the nature of warp travel. The houses maintained detailed records of their observations and experiences, recognizing that their accumulated knowledge would prove essential for understanding the evolving situation and developing effective responses to future challenges. The most forward-thinking houses began planning for scenarios that might develop decades or centuries in the future, recognizing that the changes initiated by the Great Rift would continue to influence galactic affairs for generations to come. The indispensable role of navigator houses in maintaining the Imperium's fundamental unity extends far beyond their technical function as warp pilots, encompassing their position as one of the few institutions that have remained consistently essential to Imperial civilization throughout its 10,000-year history. While other Imperial organizations have risen and fallen in importance, faced dissolution or reformation, or seen their roles diminished by technological advancement or political change, the Navigator houses have maintained their critical position precisely because their genetic heritage cannot be replicated, replaced, or improved upon through conventional means. The Emperor's decision during the Great Crusade to integrate the Navigator houses into the Imperial hierarchy rather than seeking alternatives has proven prescient, as every subsequent technological development has only reinforced their irreplaceable nature. The monopoly on safe interstellar travel, maintained by Navigator houses, creates dependencies that permeate every aspect of Imperial society, from the basic functioning of planetary governments to the highest levels of military strategy. The Adeptus Mechanicus, despite their mastery of technology and their constant search for innovation, remains utterly dependent on Navigator services for maintaining contact between their scattered Forge worlds and coordinating their galaxy-spanning research projects. The Space Marine chapters, with their superhuman capabilities and advanced equipment, cannot function effectively without Navigator support for their rapid deployment missions and strategic repositioning operations. Even the Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians, require Navigator assistance when their duties take them beyond the Sol system's boundaries. This fundamental dependency creates a unique form of political power that transcends conventional hierarchies and institutional relationships. Navigator houses possess effective veto power over Imperial expansion, military campaigns, and economic development simply through their control of transportation networks. A single house's decision to withdraw services from a particular sector can isolate entire worlds, cripple military operations, or destroy trade relationships that have existed for millennia. This power operates largely through implicit threat rather than explicit coercion, as the houses recognize that excessive use of their leverage could provoke Imperial authorities to seek alternatives or impose restrictions that might compromise their long-term interests. The institutional memory maintained by Navigator houses provides them with perspectives on Imperial history that span far longer than most other organizations can claim. While the Adeptus Mechanicus preserves technical knowledge and the Space Marines maintain their chapter histories, Navigator houses have continuously operated throughout the entire Imperial period, witnessing the rise and fall of countless Imperial officials, the success and failure of major military campaigns, and the gradual evolution of Imperial society itself. This historical perspective grants them unique insights into the long-term patterns that shape Imperial development and the cyclical nature of many challenges facing the Imperium. The ongoing challenges facing Navigator houses in the 41st millennium reflect both the accumulated stresses of their 10,000-year service and the emergence of new threats that test their traditional methods of survival and adaptation. The genetic degradation that affects all Navigator bloodlines has accelerated in recent millennia, with statistical analysis indicating that the average genetic stability of Navigator populations has declined significantly since the end of the Great Crusade. This degradation manifests in multiple ways, including increased rates of stillbirth and genetic abnormalities, reduced effectiveness of Navigator abilities, and shortened lifespans for active Navigators. The causes of this genetic deterioration appear to be multifaceted, involving both the natural tendency of extreme mutations to revert toward baseline human genetics and the accumulated damage from millennia of warp exposure. The house's traditional breeding programs, while successful in maintaining Navigator abilities across hundreds of generations, have created genetic bottlenecks that limit their ability to introduce new genetic material without compromising their essential characteristics. The most genetically pure bloodlines face the greatest risk of degradation, as their limited genetic diversity makes them vulnerable to the accumulation of harmful mutations that cannot be corrected through conventional breeding practices. The political pressure faced by navigator houses has intensified significantly since the return of Roboute Guilliman and the implementation of his administrative reforms. The Primarch's emphasis on efficiency and results-oriented governance has created new oversight mechanisms that challenge traditional navigator autonomy while demanding greater accountability for their activities. Imperial auditors now scrutinize navigator operations with unprecedented detail, questioning expenses, evaluating performance metrics, and demanding justifications for practices that the houses have maintained for millennia without external interference. The bureaucratic structures established by Guilliman's administration often conflict with navigator traditions and operational requirements, creating tensions that require careful navigation to avoid compromising either imperial efficiency or navigator effectiveness. The standardized reporting procedures imposed by imperial administrators lack understanding of the specialized nature of navigator operations, while the performance metrics used to evaluate their effectiveness fail to account for the unique challenges and risks associated with warp travel. These administrative challenges force navigator houses to allocate significant resources to compliance activities while defending their traditional practices against officials who may lack sufficient understanding of their true importance. The ever-present threat of warp-related corruption has evolved significantly since the formation of the Great Rift, with new forms of chaos influence emerging that specifically target navigator abilities and exploit their enhanced psychic sensitivity. The proliferation of warp storms across the galaxy has created regions where traditional protective measures prove inadequate, forcing navigators to operate in conditions that exceed the safety parameters developed over millennia of experience. The psychological toll of these operations has led to increased rates of mental breakdown among navigator personnel, while the physical effects of enhanced warp exposure have accelerated the mutation processes that gradually transform all navigators into increasingly alien forms. The emergence of new chaos entities that appear specifically designed to target navigator abilities represents a particularly disturbing development that suggests coordinated efforts by the Dark Gods to undermine Imperial transportation networks. These entities display knowledge of navigator physiology and psychology that exceeds what random warp phenomena should possess, indicating either evolutionary adaptation or deliberate design intended to compromise navigator effectiveness. The encounters with these entities have forced navigator houses to develop new protective rituals and defensive techniques while struggling to understand the nature of threats that seem to anticipate their traditional countermeasures. The potential future developments for the Navis Nobilite include both technological alternatives that might reduce their monopoly on warp travel and genetic enhancement techniques that could address their hereditary weaknesses. The Adeptus Mechanicus has pursued various research programs aimed at developing automated navigation systems or artificial intelligence capable of guiding vessels through warp space, though these efforts have consistently failed to achieve the reliability and safety provided by navigator abilities. The most promising technological developments involve hybrid systems that combine navigator perception with mechanical enhancement, potentially extending navigator capabilities while reducing their exposure to dangerous warp phenomena. The research into navigator genetic enhancement has accelerated significantly since the Great Rift's formation, with both Imperial and Navigator scientists working to develop techniques that could address the hereditary problems affecting their bloodlines. These research programs face significant challenges, as the Navigator gene represents one of the most complex and poorly understood mutations in the human genome. The genetic mechanisms that enable navigator abilities remain largely mysterious, making it difficult to develop enhancement techniques that improve their capabilities without compromising their essential functions or introducing new instabilities. The most promising genetic research focuses on identifying and correcting the specific mutations that cause navigator genetic degradation, potentially allowing houses to maintain their bloodline purity while eliminating the harmful effects that accumulate over successive generations. These techniques involve sophisticated gene therapy procedures that could theoretically restore genetic stability while preserving the essential characteristics that enable navigator abilities. However, the implementation of such procedures requires extensive testing and validation to ensure that they do not inadvertently compromise navigator effectiveness or introduce new forms of genetic instability. The development of alternative navigation technologies represents both an opportunity and a threat for navigator houses, as successful alternatives could reduce their monopoly while potentially providing backup systems that enhance overall imperial transportation capabilities. The houses have approached these developments with careful attention to their potential implications, recognizing that they must balance their desire to maintain their privileged position with the broader imperial need for improved transportation security and reliability. The most successful houses have positioned themselves as partners in technological development rather than obstacles to innovation, contributing their expertise to research programs while ensuring that their interests remain protected. The implications of successful technological alternatives for navigator relevance extend beyond simple replacement to encompass fundamental changes in the nature of imperial society and the role of genetic aristocracy within the imperial hierarchy. The navigator houses represent one of the last examples of hereditary privilege based on genetic superiority, and the development of alternatives to their abilities could set precedents that affect other forms of genetic-based authority within the Imperium. The political ramifications of such changes could reshape the entire structure of imperial governance while creating new forms of social organization that do not depend on inherited characteristics. The eternal burden carried by navigator houses involves balancing their duty to the Imperium with their own survival and the preservation of their ancient bloodlines in ways that create constant tension between service and self-preservation. The houses must provide essential services to the Imperium while protecting their genetic heritage from the very activities that make them valuable to imperial society. This fundamental contradiction creates ongoing stress that affects every aspect of navigator life, from individual career decisions to house-wide strategic planning. The duty to the Imperium requires navigator houses to accept risks and sacrifices that could potentially compromise their long-term survival, as the demands of imperial service often conflict with the careful genetic management necessary to maintain their bloodlines. The houses must deploy their most capable members to the most dangerous missions, while simultaneously preserving sufficient genetic diversity to ensure their continued existence. This balance becomes increasingly difficult as imperial demands intensify, while navigator populations face growing challenges from genetic degradation and warp-related threats. The preservation of ancient bloodlines requires navigator houses to maintain traditions and practices that may seem outdated or inefficient to imperial administrators focused on immediate results rather than long-term genetic stability. The houses must defend their traditional breeding programs, cultural practices, and operational methods against pressure for modernization that could compromise their essential characteristics. This defense of tradition often requires significant political capital and resources that might otherwise be devoted to improving their services or expanding their capabilities. The responsibility for maintaining the genetic heritage that enables their essential services creates unique forms of pressure that affect every member of navigator families, from the highest-ranking house leaders to the youngest potential navigators. The knowledge that their genetic legacy represents humanity's only reliable means of interstellar travel creates psychological burdens that compound the already significant stresses associated with warp exposure and navigator training. The weight of this responsibility influences every major decision made by navigator houses, from marriage arrangements to resource allocation to strategic planning. The future of the Navis Nobilite depends largely on their ability to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving the essential characteristics that make them indispensable to imperial civilization. The houses must navigate the complex challenges of genetic degradation, political pressure, and technological development while maintaining their effectiveness as the Imperium's primary means of interstellar transportation. The success of this adaptation will determine not only the survival of individual houses, but the continued unity of the Imperium itself. The legacy of the Navigator houses extends far beyond their technical contributions to encompass their role as guardians of humanity's expansion across the galaxy and witnesses to the entire sweep of Imperial history. Their genetic sacrifice has enabled the creation and maintenance of the largest human civilization in galactic history, connecting distant worlds and allowing the preservation of human culture across impossible distances. The cost of this achievement, measured in the accumulated mutations, madness, and early deaths of countless navigators, represents one of the most profound sacrifices made by any group in service to the Imperium. The continuation of this legacy requires navigator houses to maintain their essential functions while adapting to challenges that their ancestors could never have anticipated. The Great Rift's formation has fundamentally altered the nature of warp travel, while the return of Robute Guilliman has changed the political landscape in ways that affect every aspect of navigator operations. The houses must respond to these changes while preserving the traditions and capabilities that have sustained them for 10 millennia of service. The ultimate measure of navigator success lies not in their ability to maintain their privileged position or accumulate wealth and influence, but in their continued effectiveness as the bonds that hold the Imperium together. As long as human civilization spans the galaxy, the navigator houses will remain essential to its survival, their genetic heritage serving as both the foundation of Imperial unity and the burden that defines their existence. Their legacy is written in the stars themselves, in every successful voyage that connects distant worlds and maintains the fragile network of communication and trade that sustains humanity's galactic empire. The future of the Navis Nobilite, like the future of the Imperium itself, remains unwritten, shaped by the choices and sacrifices of those who carry the burden of humanity's expansion among the stars.